Flash floods on the Platte River. You ever think a calm, lazy river could turn into a death trap in less than an hour? On the Oregon Trail, it could, and it did, all the time. The Platte River was famous for looking deceptively safe. Travelers even joked it was a mile wide and an inch deep. It wasn't fast, it wasn't rocky, and it wasn't deep, so what could go wrong? Well, here's the problem. That inch-deep thing was only true when the weather was nice. If there was a thunderstorm upstream, sometimes miles away in the mountains where no one on the trail could see it, that peaceful river could rise several feet in minutes. What looked like a calm, shallow crossing could turn into a roaring wall of water before you even got all the oxen to the other side. Now picture a wagon train halfway across. Wagons weren't exactly designed to stay put. They were heavy, but they floated just enough that if water started pushing against them, they could tip, break apart, or get carried downstream like giant wooden rafts. And if one wagon went, there was a good chance it would smash into another. Oxen and horses still tied to the wagons would panic, thrash, and drown. Entire families could be swept away before anyone had time to react. And here's the kicker. People often knew the water was risky, but tried to cross anyway. They were on a tight schedule. Every delay on the trail meant they were burning through supplies and getting closer to winter. Waiting for the river to calm down could cost them days, so they gambled. Sometimes it paid off. Sometimes it was a catastrophe. First-hand accounts from trail diaries are haunting. Travelers wrote about watching neighbors disappear downriver or finding bodies days later caught in driftwood. Even if everyone survived, losing a wagon was almost as bad as death. Your food, your tools, your extra clothes, gone. Your oxen, gone. That basically meant you were now walking to Oregon with whatever you could carry, and that's assuming you didn't starve on the way. The Platte River wasn't even the worst offender, but it was one of the deadliest simply because everyone had to cross it. And unlike a mountain pass where you could see the danger ahead, this was a sneak attack from nature. No storm clouds, no warning, just a sudden, unstoppable rush of water. Crossing the Platte was a gamble every single time, and if you got it wrong, there were no second chances. Out there, the river didn't care how far you'd come or how close you were to your dream. It just took what it took, wagons, animals, and lives, and kept on flowing like nothing happened.
Dust pneumonia. Think your allergies are bad in spring? Try breathing in so much dust that your lungs feel like they're slowly turning to cement. That was life on the Oregon Trail. The trail wasn't just a road. It was a path carved by thousands of wagon wheels over open prairie. Every wagon weighed hundreds of pounds, and every step of every ox kicked up fine, powdery dirt. By the time the day's travel was halfway done, the whole wagon train would be moving inside a massive rolling cloud. People wrote in their journals that you couldn't even see the wagon in front of you sometimes. It was just dust from horizon to horizon. And this wasn't the kind of dirt you can just sneeze out and be fine. The soil on the plains was alkaline, almost chalky, and the particles were so fine they clung to everything. It was in your hair, in your blankets, in your food. You'd wake up in the morning with gritty teeth and blow dust out of your nose before you even said good morning. But the real problem was what happened once you breathed it in. Day after day of inhaling that powder would coat the inside of your throat and lungs. First, it just made you cough. Then your chest started to ache. Over time, the constant irritation turned into what people called dust pneumonia. Your lungs would swell and produce thick mucus, but you just keep breathing in more dust, making it worse. People described it as feeling like they were slowly suffocating, even though they were sitting in open air. There was no real cure on the trail. No antibiotics, no hospitals, nothing. The best you could do was stop traveling for a few days and hope your body fought it off. But stopping could mean falling behind a train, which meant less safety, less food, and more danger. Most people just pushed through it until they collapsed. Children and the elderly were hit hardest. Some wagons had to bury family members right by the roadside, then keep going as if nothing happened. Travelers tried all sorts of tricks to cope. Some tied wet rags over their faces, hoping the moisture would trap some of the dust before it got to their lungs. Others would travel at night when the air was cooler and the dust settled a bit. None of it worked very well. And the animals suffered too. Oxen would start wheezing, coughing up foamy mucus, and sometimes just drop dead in the yoke. The scariest part was the dust pneumonia didn't kill quickly like cholera did. It wore people down slowly, leaving them weaker, more dehydrated, and more likely to catch something else. For many, it was the beginning of the end, and one of the least dramatic but most relentless killers on the Oregon Trail.
Grasshopper plagues. Ever have ants get into your kitchen and ruin everything? Now crank that up to nightmare mode. On the Oregon Trail, it wasn't ants, it was grasshoppers, and not just a few. Sometimes we're talking about billions of them, moving in swarms so huge they literally block out the sun. Travelers wrote about looking up and seeing what they thought was a storm cloud, only to realize it was alive, a writhing, buzzing mass of insects sweeping toward them. When the swarm landed, it didn't just nibble on a few plants, it stripped the world bare. Grass, leaves, crops, gone in hours. And the problem for wagon trains was that they depended on that grass to feed their oxen, horses, and mules. If the animals had nothing to eat, you weren't going anywhere. But the grasshoppers didn't stop at grass. They ate anything even remotely edible. Flour, cornmeal, grain stores. They'd chew open leather bags and canvas sacks just to get to the food inside. Travelers would wake up to find holes in their wagon covers, clothing chewed through, and their carefully packed supplies ruined. There are accounts of grasshoppers eating clothing while people were wearing it. You'd have to brush them off constantly to keep them from gnawing on you. And there was no way to fight back. You couldn't swat away a billion grasshoppers. They came in a wave, and all you could do was wait it out. People tried lighting fires or making loud noises to drive them away, but it barely made a dent. Once a swarm decided to land where you were, You were stuck with them until they decided to leave. The sound was unforgettable. Travelers said it was like a hailstorm hitting the earth. The sky dimmed as if the world was ending, and when they landed, the ground literally looked like it was moving because there were so many. Kids would scream, animals would panic and break free from wagons, and the entire camp would descend into chaos. And the worst part? The devastation didn't end when the bugs left. After a swarm passed through, the land was bare. No grass meant days or weeks before livestock could graze again, if they survived at all. This forced wagon trains to ration whatever food they had left, which sometimes meant people starved while waiting for the next green patch. Grasshopper plagues weren't just gross. They could mean the difference between making it to Oregon and dying halfway. If your animals died or your food was gone, you might have to abandon your wagon, leave belongings behind, and walk the rest of the way, assuming you even had the strength. So yeah, grasshoppers might look harmless when there's just one. But out there on the trail, when billions came out of nowhere, they weren't just creepy. They were a natural disaster with wings.
Sudden prairie fires. You know that scene in movies where someone is sprinting away from a wall of fire behind them? On the Oregon Trail, that wasn't Hollywood drama. That was real life. And most of the time, people didn't outrun it. The prairie in summer was like a giant pile of dry kindling just waiting for a spark. A single lightning strike, an accidental campfire ember, or even a hot pipe tossed into the grass could be enough to start a blaze. And once that grass caught, it didn't burn slowly. Prairie grass burns like paper, fast, hot, and unstoppable. If there was wind, the fire could travel faster than a horse at full gallop. Imagine a wagon train seeing a column of smoke on the horizon. At first, it just looked like a storm cloud. Then the smell of burning hit, and the sky turned red. By the time they realized what was coming, they had minutes, maybe less, to react. The fire line could stretch for miles, racing straight toward them. And here's the scary part. There was no real way to fight it. You couldn't just dump water on it. There was no water. People sometimes tried digging trenches or beating the flames with wet blankets, but that only worked if the fire was small. For a full-on prairie fire, the only hope was to run or outsmart it. One survival tactic was to set what's called a backfire. You'd burn a strip of grass ahead of the oncoming flames, then move into the already burned area so the main fire had nothing left to consume when it reached you. Of course, this was risky. If the wind shifted, you could accidentally trap yourself between two fires. If there was a river nearby, people rushed for it, hoping to get to the other bank, or at least soak themselves and their animals. Some travelers threw wet blankets over their heads and lay flat on the ground, hoping the fire would pass over them without roasting them alive. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Even if no one died, prairie fires still spelled disaster. Wagons and animals could be lost in minutes. Travelers wrote about canvas tops catching fire like match paper, and oxen bolting in terror, dragging burning wagons behind them. When the fire passed, what was left was a blackened wasteland. No grass meant no food for livestock for miles. Families were forced to push on with starving animals or slaughter them for meat
and walked the rest of the way. Survivors said the sound of a prairie fire was like a roaring freight train, deafening, terrifying, and inescapable. Ash would rain down like black snow before the flames even arrived, coating everyone in soot. The smell of smoke would hang in the air for days. On the trail, fire wasn't just a danger. It was a sprint against nature itself. If you weren't fast, clever, or just plain lucky, it didn't matter how far you'd come. The fire took everything in its path, and it never stopped to check who was ready for it.
Heat stroke in Nebraska. Ever tried walking across a parking lot in July and felt like your shoes were melting? Now imagine doing that for 10 hours straight, every single day, while pushing a wagon. That's what travelers faced on the Nebraska stretch of the Oregon Trail. The plains in midsummer were brutal. No trees, no shade, just an endless horizon that looked like someone had ironed the earth flat. Temperatures could climb past 110 degrees, and there was no hiding from it. You couldn't just say, let's wait this out. If you stop too long, you lose time, run out of food, or get caught by early winter in the mountains. So people kept walking, mile after mile under a merciless sun. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Your body tries to cool itself by sweating, but when you're walking all day, sweating just means you're losing water faster than you can replace it. Travelers wrote about their clothes turning white with salt from dried sweat. Lips cracked and bled, eyes burned from the glare, and dehydration set in quickly. Heat stroke is no joke. It's what happens when your body can't get rid of heat fast enough. First you feel dizzy, then your thinking goes fuzzy, and if you don't cool down, you can collapse and die within hours. And cooling down on the trail? That wasn't easy. There were no shaded rest stops, no ice water, no fans. The best you could do was try to find a patch of taller grass to sit in, or wait until nightfall. But every break risked falling behind schedule. Water was a constant problem. People carried barrels or kegs on the wagons, but those got warm fast and had to last days between rivers. That meant rationing, even when everyone was thirsty. Imagine walking in blistering heat and being told you can only have a few sips of lukewarm water for the whole afternoon. Some people got so desperate they drank from stagnant pools that made them sick later. And it wasn't just the people suffering. The animals pulling the wagons were dropping too. Oxen collapsed from exhaustion and heat stress, and if they died, the wagon had to be abandoned or dragged forward by hand. Travelers sometimes walked at night or set out before sunrise to avoid the worst heat, but the sun always caught up. Some diaries mention how wagon wheels squeaked louder in the heat because the grease melted away. And shoes got so soft they'd start to fall apart. The horizon would shimmer with heat mirages, tricking exhausted travelers into thinking they saw a lake just ahead, only to find dry, cracked earth waiting for them. The Nebraska plains were a test of endurance. It wasn't a single dramatic event like a river crossing or a prairie fire. It was a slow, grinding struggle that cooked you alive a little more each day. If the heat didn't break your body, it broke your spirit. And for many on the trail, that was just as deadly.
Freezing blizzards in the Blue Mountains. Think a snow day is fun. On the Oregon Trail,
Snow didn't mean sledding. It meant starvation and death. By the time wagon trains reached the Blue Mountains in what's now northeastern Oregon, they were almost at the finish line. Spirits were high, but so was the pressure. The trouble was, if you arrived late in the season, those mountains could turn into a trap overnight. Early snowstorms were not uncommon, and when they hit hard. Imagine this. You go to sleep in your wagon after a long day's march, and by morning there's a foot of snow on the ground. By the next night, there's 2 feet, and it's still falling. The trail vanishes completely, leaving you stuck in a white wasteland. The wheels of the wagons won't turn. The oxen refuse to pull, and you can't see more than a few yards ahead. The temperature could drop fast, too. Canvas wagon covers weren't made for this. They were thin, leaky, and provided almost no insulation. Families huddled together for warmth, sometimes sleeping in shifts to keep a fire going. But wood was scarce in the mountains, and after a few days, the only thing left to burn was the wagon itself. People really did dismantle their own wagons to keep from freezing, knowing that if they ever got out, they'd have no transport left. Food was another nightmare. Anything fresh froze solid, and whatever rations were left ran out quickly when travel stopped. Hunting was almost impossible. The deer and elk had moved on, and smaller game was buried under snow. That meant travelers had to ration down to the smallest portions, stretching a few pounds of flour for weeks. Some boiled leather straps or chewed rawhide just to have something in their stomachs. And then came the real danger, starvation. When you're burning calories just to stay warm, you get weaker by the day. Parents faced unthinkable choices: feed the children and go hungry themselves, or share equally and risk everyone starving together. Blizzards also killed livestock outright. Oxen and horses froze where they stood, leaving wagons useless even after the snow melted. Some families had to abandon everything and try to walk out of the mountains, a journey that could take days through waist-deep snow. Every traveler knew about the Donner Party, trapped in early snow in the Sierra Nevada, and that fear haunted them. Being stuck in the Blue Mountains felt like watching history try to repeat itself. Even if you survived the storm, the delay could be fatal in another way. Reaching Oregon too late to plant crops meant facing your first winter with no food. The Oregon Trail was already a gauntlet, but getting snowed in so close to the finish line was the cruelest twist of all. On the trail, snow wasn't beautiful. It was a silent killer. And in the Blue Mountains, if winter came early, you might not live to see spring.
Mosquito swarms. You think mosquitoes are annoying today? On the Oregon Trail, they didn't just leave you itchy. They could knock you flat for weeks. Certain stretches of the trail were basically mosquito heaven. Swampy river bottoms, slow-moving creeks, and marshy areas. As soon as wagon trains rolled into those regions, it was game over for comfort. Travelers described clouds of mosquitoes so thick they looked like smoke hanging over the grass. You could hear them before you saw them, a constant high-pitched whine that meant you were about to get eaten alive. And these mosquitoes didn't politely go after your arms and legs. They went for your face, your neck, anywhere they could get through clothing. People wrapped their heads in scarves and blankets despite the heat, and still woke up with swollen eyes and bleeding bites. Some travelers swore you could kill a handful of them just by clapping your hands in the air. But the bites weren't just irritating. They could make you dangerously sick. Many of these mosquitoes carried malaria, which people back then called ague. And if you think malaria just meant a bad fever for a couple of days, think again. It came in cycles. You'd burn up with a fever one day, shake with chills the next, sweat through your clothes the day after that, and then the whole thing would start over. Malaria left people exhausted, barely able to walk, let alone push a wagon or manage oxen. And there wasn't much you could do about it. Quinine bark tea was the best-known treatment, but it was hard to find on the trail. Mostly, people just had to wait it out while trying not to fall too far behind the group. The domino effect was brutal. A sick family slowed everyone down. The rest of the wagon train either had to camp with them, burning through food and risking their own exposure to mosquitoes, or leave them behind to recover on their own, which was basically a death sentence. And it wasn't just the humans who suffered. Livestock were attacked so badly they'd stampede in the middle of the night, breaking loose and running off into the darkness. Oxen driven crazy by bites might refuse to pull the wagons the next morning. At night, people tried lighting smudge fires, smoky fires meant to drive the bugs away, just to get a few hours of sleep. But then you were choking in smoke in an already stifling wagon. Some folks bundled up in blankets head to toe despite the heat, trading comfort for fewer bites. So yeah, mosquitoes weren't just annoying. They were a constant buzzing reminder that nature was against you every step of the way. And if you were unlucky, one tiny bite could be the reason you never made it to Oregon.
Quicksand and mud holes. Picture leading your wagon across what looks like solid ground, and then watching your oxen sink like they just stepped into wet cement. That was a very real nightmare for travelers on the Oregon Trail. Not every danger out there was obvious. Quicksand and hidden mud holes were some of the trickiest hazards because you usually didn't know they were there until it was too late. These soft spots often formed near rivers, stream beds, or low-lying flats that held groundwater just under the surface. On a hot, dusty day, they looked like perfectly safe patches of dirt. But once you stepped on them, or worse, drove a wagon over them, the ground gave way. The result was instant panic. Oxen could sink up to their bellies within seconds, thrashing and bellowing while the wagon tilted dangerously behind them. Travelers had to work fast, unhooking animals and rushing to dig them out before they got too exhausted to stand. Imagine trying to heave a 1,000-pound animal out of suctioning mud while standing in mud yourself. People often had to use ropes and teams of other animals to pull a single ox free, and sometimes it didn't work. There are diary accounts of entire teams of oxen being swallowed up, never to be seen again. When that happened, families had to make brutal decisions, abandon the wagon entirely, or try to drag it forward by hand. If there were spare animals in the train, they might be borrowed, but usually everyone was already stretched thin. Losing your team could mean the end of your trip. Even if the animals survived, the wagons could get stuck so badly it took hours or even days to dig them out. That meant burning through food and water supplies while you were immobilized. And when you're on a tight schedule to cross the Rockies before snow season, every lost day is a potential death sentence. Some travelers got caught themselves. Fall into a mud hole and you might find your legs sucked down so hard you couldn't move. People sometimes stripped off their clothes to dig more freely in the muck, knowing they'd have to wash or discard them later. And yes, there were cases where people simply disappeared if no one could reach them in time. Quicksand didn't just happen in the movies. The psychological toll was heavy, too. Imagine watching your entire source of survival, your animals, your wagon, your food, slowly disappear into the ground. There was no cavalry coming to save you, no road crew to pull you out. It was just you, your bare hands, and the hope that you were strong enough to win a tug-of-war with the earth itself. On the Oregon Trail, danger wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just a patch of innocent-looking dirt waiting to turn your journey into a desperate fight for survival.
Kettle stampedes. You think your neighbor's dog barking at night is annoying? Try waking up to 2 tons of panicked oxen charging straight through your camp. That was the reality for travelers on the Oregon Trail, and if you were unlucky, it could be the last thing you ever heard. Night on the prairie was usually quiet, except for the wind and the creaking of wagon ropes. The oxen and cattle would be hobbled or loosely herded nearby, grazing or lying down. But the problem with having dozens of half-wild animals next to your camp was how easily they could be spooked. A distant wolf howl, a clap of thunder, a gunshot, or even someone dropping a metal pot could set off a chain reaction. Once the first ox panicked, the rest followed. And when a couple 1,000 pounds of muscle decides to run, you can't exactly stop it. A stampede was loud. Travelers said it sounded like rolling thunder or even an earthquake as the ground shook under their feet. You'd wake to total chaos, shouting, screaming, animals bellowing, wagons tipping over as teams ripped free of their yokes. And stampedes weren't just scary, they were deadly. If you were sleeping on the ground, you might not have time to get out of the way. People were trampled to death in the dark, sometimes without the stampede even slowing down. Wagons were smashed, food barrels split open, tools scattered everywhere. Even if no one died, losing animals was devastating. Your oxen were your engine. No oxen meant no wagon movement. That left travelers stranded until they could catch their scattered herd, which could take days. If the animals ran too far or were stolen by opportunistic raiders, the wagon might have to be abandoned altogether. Turning a stampede was one of the most dangerous jobs on the trail. Experienced drovers would grab torches, jump on horseback, and try to ride alongside the herd, slowly steering it into a wide circle until it ran itself out. Sometimes they'd fire guns into the air or yell at the top of their lungs. It was high risk. One wrong move, and you could get thrown, trampled, or dragged under hooves. Worse, stampedes sometimes ended in mass tragedy. A panicked herd might run straight into a river or off a ravine. Travelers wrote about finding half their herd drowned or broken at the bottom of a slope the next morning. To prevent this, some wagon trains tied bells to lead animals so they could track where they'd gone if the stampede happened at night. But even that was just damage control. If your animals bolted, you were going to lose time, food, and possibly your chance of reaching Oregon before winter. On the trail, a stampede wasn't just noise in the night. It was a freight train of living animals coming straight through your camp, and you had seconds to react. If you were lucky, you lived to tell about it. If not, well, the herd didn't stop to check.
Prairie lightning strikes. Ever been scared of a thunderstorm? Now imagine being the tallest thing on the horizon and realizing the lightning might be aiming for you. That was the reality for wagon trains crossing the open prairie. The Great Plains were stunning, but also terrifying during a storm. There were no trees, no hills, no buildings, just an endless stretch of flat grass. When a thunderstorm rolled in, there was nowhere to hide. You could see the storm coming from miles, a black wall of clouds swallowing the sky, and you knew you were about to be in the middle of it, whether you liked it or not. And when it hit hard. Plains thunderstorms were massive, with lightning bolts that seemed to touch the entire horizon. Travelers wrote about the sky lighting up so bright it looked like daylight for a split second, then plunging them back into pitch blackness. The thunder was deafening, rattling the wagons and echoing across the prairie. The problem? With no trees or tall objects around, people, wagons, and livestock became the tallest things in the area. And lightning loves the tallest thing. A single bolt could strike the metal hoops of a wagon cover, killing the animals tied to it or the people inside. There are diary accounts of entire teams of oxen being killed instantly by one strike, leaving the travelers stranded miles from help. It wasn't just the direct strikes that were deadly. Lightning could hit the ground nearby, sending a current through the soil that stunned or killed anyone standing too close. Some travelers learned to spread out during storms so that one strike wouldn't wipe out the whole group. Others threw down their metal tools, guns, or cooking gear, hoping to make themselves less of a target. And storms didn't just threaten lives, they threatened progress. Terrified oxen could break loose and stampede, scattering for miles in the middle of the night. That meant precious time spent gathering them back up the next day, if they were found at all. Then there was the fire risk. One unlucky strike could ignite the dry grass, starting a prairie fire that raced across the plains faster than wagons could run. That turned a terrifying storm into a full-blown survival event, forcing families to set back fires or flee for their lives. On top of the physical danger, storms were psychologically brutal. Some travelers were so shaken by lightning strikes that they refused to keep moving during storms, insisting on waiting them out even if it meant losing time. Others saw the strikes as bad omens, a sign that they shouldn't be traveling at all.
Out there on the trail, there were no safe basements, no shelters, no weather alerts. Just you, a wagon, and the biggest light show on Earth, one that could end you in a single flash.
Cholera outbreaks. Forget gunfights and wagon crashes. The deadliest killer on the Oregon Trail wasn't traumatic at all. It was diarrhea. Yep, you heard that right. The #1 cause of death on the Oregon Trail was cholera, a bacterial infection that spread like wildfire among travelers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was terrifying. Once cholera hit a wagon train, it could wipe out dozens of people in a matter of days. Here's how it happened. Everyone on the trail had to use the same rivers and streams for drinking water, washing, and, well, everything else. All it took was one contaminated water source for the bacteria to spread. People who seemed perfectly healthy at breakfast could be dead by nightfall. That's how fast it worked. The symptoms came on suddenly: intense diarrhea, vomiting, painful cramps, and extreme dehydration. Victims sometimes lost so much fluid so quickly that their skin turned a bluish gray color, which is why cholera was nicknamed the Blue Death. And because you lost electrolytes and fluids so fast, you could literally die within 12 hours of the first symptom. This wasn't just a medical problem, it was a psychological nightmare. Imagine sitting around the campfire one night, talking with your neighbors, and the next morning you're helping dig their grave. And there were so many graves. Some parts of the trail were nicknamed cholera graveyards because every few hundred feet there was another burial marker. Treatment options were basically non-existent. The best solution was rehydration, drinking water and replacing lost salts. But water itself was often scarce or already contaminated. Some people tried home remedies like whiskey, opium, or vinegar, but those usually did more harm than good. And because everyone was terrified of catching it, the sick were often left behind. Diaries describe travelers being abandoned by the trail, too weak to keep going, given a small amount of food and water, and left to die alone. It sounds cruel, but people thought it was the only way to stop the spread and save the rest of the group. Even burials had to be quick. Families dug shallow graves right next to the trail and marked them with rocks, sticks, or whatever they had on hand. Sometimes wagons rolled right over fresh graves on the way out of camp because there wasn't time to do anything more. Cholera didn't care how strong you were or how careful you tried to be. It was invisible, unstoppable, and always lurking in the next waterhole. If you survived the Oregon Trail, it was often because you got lucky enough to drink from the right stream and not the wrong one.
Typhoid from river crossings. You'd think finally reaching a river on the Oregon Trail was a blessing. After days of walking in heat and dust, a cool drink of water sounds like salvation. But sometimes taking that drink was the most dangerous thing you could do. Typhoid fever was another silent killer on the trail, and it came from the very thing you needed most: water. The bacteria that causes typhoid spreads through water contaminated with human or animal waste. And when you've got hundreds of people, dozens of wagons, and entire herds of oxen all crossing and camping by the same river, you can guess what happened to the water supply. The symptoms didn't hit as fast as cholera, but that almost made it worse. People would start with a fever, then feel tired and weak. Then came stomach pain, sometimes diarrhea, sometimes constipation. Either way, your gut was a mess. The fever just kept climbing higher until people were delirious, sometimes talking nonsense or unable to get up. The illness could last for weeks, which was a death sentence on the trail if you couldn't keep up with the group. And even if you survived, typhoid left you so weak that walking, let alone hauling gear, felt impossible. Entire wagon trains were delayed because half their members were sick and couldn't travel. But waiting meant using up precious supplies and risking getting trapped by winter. It was a lose-lose situation. Typhoid wasn't always immediately deadly like cholera, but it was cruel in its own way. People often wasted away slowly, dying of dehydration or secondary infections. Some recovered, but never fully regained their strength, limping into Oregon weeks behind schedule, barely clinging to life. Travelers knew certain river crossings were dangerous. Diaries mention people warning newcomers not to drink from bad watering holes because too many had died there. Some groups tried digging shallow wells nearby or catching rainwater to avoid the river, but that took time, and on the trail time was as precious as food. Children were hit hardest. Entire families lost multiple kids to typhoid in the same week. Imagine burying one child by the side of the road only to have to dig another grave the next day. The emotional toll was devastating, but the wagon train had to keep moving. And the worst part? You couldn't tell just by looking at a river whether it was safe. A crystal clear stream might be teeming with bacteria, while a muddy one might be fine. Every drink was a gamble, and you had to gamble several times a day just to stay alive. On the Oregon Trail, water wasn't always life. Sometimes it was death, disguised as a refreshing drink. And the price of taking that risk could be everything you had.
Measles epidemics. One sick kid could take down an entire wagon train, and that's not an exaggeration. On the Oregon Trail, measles was one of the most feared illnesses, and for good reason. Measles is a viral infection so contagious that if one person gets it, nearly everyone around them will too if they're not immune. And wagon trains were perfect breeding grounds for it. Families traveled close together, shared water, ate around the same fire, and slept side by side in cramped spaces. If one child started coughing, it was only a matter of time before everyone in the train was exposed. The symptoms were brutal. First came the high fever, the runny nose, the red, watery eyes. Then the cough set in, hacking and relentless, keeping kids up at night and draining what little strength they had. Finally, the rash appeared, spreading across the face and body, a sure sign that the whole camp was in trouble. But the rash wasn't the real danger. It was the complications.
Measles often led to pneumonia, ear infections, and in severe cases, encephalitis, swelling of the brain that caused seizures, brain damage, or death. Children were especially vulnerable, and on the trail, medical care was nearly non-existent. A sick child might get rest, water, and a little comfort, but there were no antivirals, no antibiotics for pneumonia, no hospital beds. Parents just had to watch and hope. And it almost never stopped with one child. Once measles entered a wagon train, it spread through everyone who hadn't had it before. Adults could get it too, and while it was less deadly for them, it left them weak and unable to work. A disaster when every able-bodied person was needed to keep the wagons moving. Travel diaries are heartbreaking. Parents wrote about losing multiple children in the same outbreak, burying them one after another along the trail. Some described their wagons as rolling hospitals, with sick kids bundled under blankets, while the healthy ones tried to care for them between bouts of crying and exhaustion. Quarantine was almost impossible. Families sometimes traveled apart from the rest of the group to avoid infecting others, but that was dangerous. Fewer people meant less protection from bandits, fewer hands to fix wagons, fewer scouts to find water. And by the time you realized the child was sick, the virus had usually already spread. Measles didn't just devastate wagon trains. It also hit Native American tribes hard when settlers passed through. Tribes with no immunity sometimes lost entire villages, which led to grief, anger, and conflict with travelers who unknowingly carried the virus. On the Oregon Trail, a child's cough wasn't just a small worry. It was a warning sign that tragedy might be coming for everyone. And for many families, measles meant their dream of reaching Oregon ended at a lonely grave by the side of the road.
Dysentery. If you've ever had food poisoning, imagine it lasting for weeks while you're walking 15 miles a day and sharing one shovel for a bathroom. Welcome to dysentery on the Oregon Trail. Dysentery wasn't some rare dramatic disease. It was everywhere. This was a bacterial or amoebic infection that caused severe diarrhea, stomach cramps, fever, and dehydration. And it spread fast because sanitation on the trail was, well, almost non-existent. Think about how a wagon train worked. Hundreds of people and animals camping in the same area every night, digging shallow latrines that sometimes weren't far enough from the water source. Then you've got flies, landing on waste, then on food, spreading bacteria from person to person without anyone noticing. Once dysentery got onto a group, it could rip through almost everyone in a matter of days. The symptoms were miserable. Constant diarrhea, sometimes mixed with blood, that left travelers too weak to stand. Cramps so painful you could barely straighten up. Fever that made you shiver at night and sweat through your clothes by day. And here's the kicker. You still had to keep walking. Nobody could afford to stop and wait for you to get better. Dysentery didn't always kill quickly like cholera, but it was a slow grind that wore people down until they couldn't go on. Dehydration was the real danger. Without enough water, your body just shut down. Travelers sometimes ran out of water entirely, meaning they couldn't replace the fluids they were losing. And even if you survived, you were left weak, malnourished, and more vulnerable to other illnesses. Dysentery often came in waves, reinfecting the same people multiple times because the conditions never really improved. You still had the same shallow latrines, the same flies, and the same need to eat food that might be contaminated. Travel diaries didn't shy away from describing just how awful it was. Some wrote about the overwhelming smell of camps during outbreaks, how people were too sick to bury waste properly, and how morale dropped to rock bottom. Dysentery was so common that it became almost a grim joke, just part of the trail experience. But it wasn't funny when multiple people in a single family were too sick to walk. That could mean the difference between staying with the wagon train or being left behind to recover, if you were lucky enough to recover at all. Historians estimate dysentery may have killed nearly as many travelers as cholera did over the entire migration period. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it was constant. Dysentery made sure that even if you escaped floods, fires, and stampedes, you still had to fight a daily battle with your own stomach just to stay alive.
Heat stroke in Nebraska. Ever tried walking across a parking lot in July and felt like your shoes were melting? Now imagine doing that for 10 hours straight, every single day, while pushing a wagon. That's what travelers faced on the Nebraska stretch of the Oregon Trail. The plains in midsummer were brutal. No trees, no shade, just an endless horizon that looked like someone had ironed the earth flat. Temperatures could climb past 110 degrees, and there was no hiding from it. You couldn't just say, let's wait this out. If you stop too long, you lose time, run out of food, or get caught by early winter in the mountains. So people kept walking, mile after mile under a merciless sun. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Your body tries to cool itself by sweating, but when you're walking all day, sweating just means you're losing water faster than you can replace it. Travelers wrote about their clothes turning white with salt from dried sweat. Lips cracked and bled, eyes burned from the glare, and dehydration set in quickly. Heat stroke is no joke. It's what happens when your body can't get rid of heat fast enough. First you feel dizzy, then your thinking goes fuzzy, and if you don't cool down, you can collapse and die within hours. And cooling down on the trail? That wasn't easy. There were no shaded rest stops, no ice water, no fans. The best you could do was try to find a patch of taller grass to sit in, or wait until nightfall. But every break risked falling behind schedule. Water was a constant problem. People carried barrels or kegs on the wagons, but those got warm fast and had to last days between rivers. That meant rationing, even when everyone was thirsty. Imagine walking in blistering heat and being told you can only have a few sips of lukewarm water for the whole afternoon. Some people got so desperate they drank from stagnant pools that made them sick later. And it wasn't just the people suffering. The animals pulling the wagons were dropping too. Oxen collapsed from exhaustion and heat stress, and if they died, the wagon had to be abandoned or dragged forward by hand. Travelers sometimes walked at night or set out before sunrise to avoid the worst heat, but the sun always caught up.
Some diaries mention how wagon wheels squeaked louder in the heat because the grease melted away. And shoes got so soft they'd start to fall apart. The horizon would shimmer with heat mirages, tricking exhausted travelers into thinking they saw a lake just ahead, only to find dry, cracked earth waiting for them. The Nebraska plains were a test of endurance. It wasn't a single dramatic event like a river crossing or a prairie fire. It was a slow, grinding struggle that cooked you alive a little more each day. If the heat didn't break your body, it broke your spirit. And for many on the trail, that was just as deadly.
Smallpox reemergences. One traveler with a fever could turn an entire wagon train into a nightmare quarantine zone. That's how terrifying smallpox was on the Oregon Trail. Smallpox wasn't as common as cholera or dysentery, but when it showed up, it was catastrophic. It started like a regular fever, chills, body aches, maybe some nausea. People might still be working or walking with the wagon train, thinking it was just a cold. But then the rash appeared, first as small red spots, then as raised bumps that filled with pus until they covered the entire body. Smallpox was incredibly contagious. It spread through coughing, sneezing, even touching blankets or clothing used by the sick. And wagon trains were perfect breeding grounds. Families shared wagons, cooked at the same fire, and camped close together. By the time the first person showed visible symptoms, dozens of others might already have been infected. The death rate was high, sometimes 30% or more, and survivors were often left with deep scars that lasted a lifetime. This made smallpox one of the most feared diseases on the trail. The sight of a single case could send an entire camp into panic. What to do with a sick traveler was an agonizing decision. Some wagon trains tried to isolate infected families in separate wagons and travel at a distance. Others stopped completely, waiting weeks for the outbreak to run its course, losing valuable time and risking starvation or early snow in the mountains. And sometimes, harsh as it sounds, the infected were left behind. The fear of wiping out the whole wagon train was too great. Even if the group survived, the aftermath was devastating. People were weak from fever, some blinded by eye infections caused by the disease, and many permanently scarred. The outbreak could set a group back by weeks, a delay that could mean getting caught in winter passes or running out of food before reaching Oregon. Smallpox didn't just threaten travelers. Passing wagon trains also brought the virus into Native American lands, and entire villages were sometimes wiped out because they had no immunity. This created grief and anger that sometimes turned into conflict between settlers and tribes, a tragic ripple effect that went far beyond a single wagon train. There were a few primitive forms of vaccination available, a process called variolation, where material from a smallpox sore was scratched into a healthy person's skin to trigger a mild case and immunity. But it wasn't always available, and it carried its own risk of spreading the disease. On the trail, spotting those first pockmarks meant fear, isolation, and tough choices no one wanted to make. Smallpox wasn't just a sickness. It was a traveling nightmare that could derail your entire journey and take your family with it.
Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency. Who knew skipping your veggies could actually kill you? On the Oregon Trail, it did. Slowly and painfully. The diet on the trail was, let's just say, not what any doctor would recommend. Most wagon trains relied on flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and maybe some dried fruit if they were lucky. Fresh fruits and vegetables? Almost impossible to come by, and without them, people developed scurvy, a disease that turned your own body against you. Scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C. Your body uses vitamin C to make collagen, the protein that keeps your skin, blood vessels, and connective tissues healthy. Without it, everything starts to break down. First came the fatigue. People would feel weak and sluggish even after resting. Then came the bleeding gums. They'd swell, turn dark, and bleed whenever you tried to eat. Teeth started to loosen and even fall out. And it didn't stop there. People bruised easily. Their joints ached, and even small cuts refused to heal. Old wounds could reopen just from walking. Travelers wrote about seeing dark purple spots appear on their legs as their blood vessels weakened and started to leak under the skin. It was a slow, miserable way to die. On the trail, scurvy wasn't rare. It was a constant threat on the long, fruitless stretches of land. People who got too weak to walk slowed the entire wagon train, forcing everyone to choose between waiting for them to recover or leaving them behind. Neither option was good. Some travelers figured out workarounds. They gathered wild onions, berries, or rose hips whenever they could find them. Some even made pine needle tea, which is surprisingly high in vitamin C. Forts along the trail sometimes sold pickled vegetables or preserved fruit for outrageous prices. But if you had the money, it could save your life. But not everyone had that option. Families on a tight budget had to make do with what they brought. And by the end of the trip, many were showing obvious signs of vitamin deficiency. There are reports of wagon trains reaching Oregon with nearly everyone suffering from bleeding gums and weakness. The scariest part about scurvy was how slow it was. Unlike cholera or dysentery, which killed fast, scurvy just wore you down week after week until you could barely move. And if you didn't fix it, you eventually died from infection, organ failure, or simply being too weak to continue. Today, scurvy sounds like something from pirate stories, but on the Oregon Trail, it was just part of life. A lack of something as simple as a fresh orange or a handful of greens could mean the difference between finishing the journey and becoming another grave by the side of the road.
Malaria on Missouri River lowlands. Some pioneers were already half dead before they even reached the prairie, thanks to a disease carried by tiny buzzing mosquitoes. Most wagon trains started their journey somewhere along the Missouri River. It was the big jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail. But there was a problem. The Missouri lowlands were swampy, full of slow-moving water and crawling with mosquitoes. And those mosquitoes carried malaria, or as pioneers called it, ague or swamp fever. Malaria is caused by parasites that get into your blood when a mosquito bites you. It doesn't just make you sick once, it hits you over and over in cycles. One day you're burning up with a fever, shaking so hard you can barely hold a cup of water. The next day you're sweating buckets as the fever breaks, too exhausted to get out of bed. Then, just when you start to feel normal again, the fever comes back, over and over until you're completely drained. Imagine trying to start a months-long, grueling journey across the continent while you can barely stand. Some pioneers had to delay their departure because too many people in the wagon train were sick at once.
Others set out anyway, dragging themselves down the trail with fevers, chills, and aching bones. That was a dangerous gamble. If you were already weak before the first big river crossing a mountain pass, your odds of surviving the rest of the trail dropped dramatically. Malaria didn't always kill directly, but it made people so weak that they were easy prey for other diseases. A traveler who survived ague might later die from cholera, dysentery, or simple dehydration because their body couldn't keep up. Treatment on the trail was limited. Quinine bark tea was the go-to remedy if you could find it, but it was bitter, expensive, and not always available in frontier outposts. Mostly, people just had to wait out the fever, trying not to fall behind the group while their bodies fought the infection. Animals suffered too. Though livestock didn't get malaria, they still had to graze and drink in mosquito-infested areas, which meant they were constantly harassed and weakened from lack of rest, adding more stress to the travelers who depended on them. The psychological toll was just as bad as the physical one. Travelers wrote about entire camps shivering with fever at night, unable to cook, move, or work, knowing that every day of delay meant a higher chance of getting trapped by winter later on. Starting the Oregon Trail already sick felt like running a marathon with a broken leg. Malaria wasn't as dramatic as a river crossing or a buffalo stampede, but it quietly crushed people before they even got to the hardest parts of the journey, and for some, it made sure they never would.
Childbirth deaths. Imagine giving birth in a bouncing wagon miles from the nearest doctor, and knowing that if something went wrong, there was nothing anyone could do. That was the reality for many women on the Oregon Trail. Wagon trains weren't just groups of rugged adventurers. They were full of young families. Many women started the journey already pregnant, hoping to reach Oregon before the baby arrived. But babies don't always stick to a schedule, and plenty of them decided to come halfway across the prairie. Childbirth was dangerous in the 1800s, even under the best conditions. There were no antibiotics, no sterile surgical tools, and no reliable pain relief. On the trail, it was even worse. Most births were handled by other women in the wagon train, neighbors, friends, or whoever had the most experience. But few were trained midwives. If labor went smoothly, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. If it didn't, things could turn tragic very quickly. There were so many risks. A baby stuck in the birth canal could mean hours or days of agonizing labor with no way to perform a C-section. Postpartum hemorrhage, heavy bleeding after birth, often killed women within hours. And even if mother and baby survived the delivery, infection was a constant threat. Childbed fever could set in days later, leaving the mother shivering with fever until she died. There are heartbreaking accounts in travelers' journals of burying new mothers by the roadside, often with the newborn in the same grave. And the wagon train couldn't stop for long. After a brief service, everyone had to keep moving, leaving the fresh graves behind in the dust. Even when everything went right, the hardship didn't stop. Some women gave birth on the trail and were back on their feet within a day or two, walking alongside the wagon while still recovering. The lack of rest and proper nutrition put them at risk of complications, but there was no other choice. And for babies, survival was never guaranteed. Without clean water, proper shelter, or medical care, many newborns died within days. Fathers sometimes had to make terrible decisions, trying to find another nursing mother in the wagon train, giving the baby to another family to raise, or turning back entirely if there was no way to care for the child.
birth, which should have been a moment of joy, was one of the most dangerous events on the trail. Every pregnant woman knew she was gambling her life and her baby's life just by being there. And yet many chose to keep going, because reaching Oregon offered a chance for a better future, if they lived long enough to see it.
Gangrene from minor injuries. On the Oregon Trail, it wasn't just wolves, floods, or bandits you had to fear. Sometimes the thing that killed you was a simple splinter. Life on the trail was rough on the body. Every day meant hauling gear, repairing wagons, handling livestock, chopping wood, cooking over open fires. Cuts, scrapes, blisters, and splinters were constant. Most people didn't think twice about them. You just wrapped a rag around it, kept walking, and hoped it would heal. But in those conditions, with dust, dirt, and animal waste everywhere, tiny wounds could turn deadly. Gangrene was the name for what happened when tissue died, either from infection or from lack of blood flow. At first, it just looked like a normal infection: red, swollen skin, maybe a little pus. But when there was no proper cleaning, no antiseptic, and no clean bandages, things got worse fast. The wound would swell, turn dark, and eventually the skin and flesh would turn black and start to rot. Once gangrene set in, the danger wasn't just losing the finger, hand, or foot. It was the infection spreading to the blood. Blood poisoning, or sepsis, caused high fever, delirium, and death. And there was no coming back from that on the trail. The only treatment available was brutal: amputation. If you wanted to live, the infected part had to come off. And that meant doing it right there on the prairie, usually with whatever tools the wagon train had: a saw, a sharp knife, maybe a bit of whiskey to numb the pain, if you were lucky. People had to be held down while their friends or family did the cutting, then pray the bleeding could be stopped before they bled out. Some travelers refused amputation, either out of fear or pride, and died within days. Others survived, but were left crippled, forced to ride in a wagon for the rest of the journey, or hobble along on crutches. Losing a limb on the trail meant you might never work your farm once you reached Oregon, assuming you even made it there. Diaries from the time describe the horror of watching a wound go bad. The smell of rotting flesh was unmistakable, and everyone in camp knew what it meant. There are heartbreaking entries about parents having to choose between sawing off a child's arm or letting them die. And it wasn't just cuts that caused it. Burns from campfires, frostbite from winter storms, and crushed injuries from wagon accidents were especially prone to gangrene because blood couldn't circulate properly in the damaged tissue. Today, antibiotics make gangrene far less common. But for pioneers, every splinter or cut was a gamble. Would it heal on its own, or would you have to decide between losing a limb or losing your life? Spoiled bacon. Ever been grossed out by a bad piece of meat in your fridge? Now imagine your only meat supply being full of maggots and having to eat it anyway. Salt pork, which pioneers usually just called bacon, was the go-to meat on the Oregon Trail. It was cheap, it was preserved, and it could last a long time, in theory.
It was packed into barrels with salt or brine and loaded onto wagons at the start of the journey. Sounds good, right? The problem was those barrels sat for weeks or even months under the blazing sun, being shaken around every mile of the way. By the time they were opened on the prairie, what came out was often barely recognizable as food. Travelers wrote about barrels full of bacon that had turned slimy, yellow, and rancid. The smell alone could knock you back. And sometimes when they pulled out a slab, it was crawling with worms or maggots. If you think that was the moment to throw it away, think again. There was no throwing it away. That was your meat supply, and there might not be another animal to hunt for 100 miles. So what did they do? They salvaged what they could. Mold was scraped off. Maggots were shaken or boiled out. People soaked rancid bacon in water or vinegar overnight, hoping to make it edible. Then it was boiled again, sometimes multiple times, to get rid of the smell. And after all that, they ate it. Because the choice wasn't between spoiled meat and fresh meat, it was between spoiled meat and nothing. And yes, it sometimes makes people sick. Spoiled meat could cause vomiting, diarrhea, and painful cramps, the last thing you wanted while walking 15 miles a day. But most people decided a bad night of stomach pain was better than starving. There are diary accounts of travelers so desperate they ate bacon that was literally wriggling with maggots, just brushing them off as best they could. Others admitted that they closed their eyes and tried not to think about what they were chewing. It was that or go hungry. Sometimes spoiled meat wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Botulism and severe food poisoning were always risks, and if several people in the wagon train got sick at once, it slowed everyone down, burned through supplies, and could even lead to deaths from dehydration. Spoiled meat wasn't a one-time horror, it was a recurring nightmare. Every time a new barrel was opened, there was a moment of suspense. Was it still good, or had the sun and shaking turned it into something you'd rather not put near your mouth? On the Oregon Trail, you didn't have the luxury of being picky. You either scraped the mold, boiled the maggots, and choked it down, or you risked starving long before you saw Oregon.
Flour full of bugs. Ever had to throw out a bag of flour because it had bugs in it? On the Oregon Trail, you just picked the bugs out, or didn't, and kept baking. Flour was the backbone of the pioneer diet. It made biscuits, bread, dumplings, pancakes, basically the main source of calories for months. Wagon trains carried it in barrels or sacks, but those sacks were bouncing along dusty trails in the heat for weeks on end. And that was perfect conditions for weevils, beetles, and worms to move in and set up shop. When families opened a barrel of flour, they sometimes found more life in it than they wanted. Little black specks crawling through it, larvae wriggling around, or thin cobweb-like threads where insects had been tunneling. The smell could even turn sour if the bugs had been in there long enough. But here's the thing. You couldn't just throw it out. Flour was too valuable. If you tossed an infested barrel, you might run out of food halfway across the prairie. So people got creative. Some travelers sifted the flour through a cloth or fine screen to remove as many bugs as they could. Others spread it on blankets in the sun, hoping the heat would make the insects crawl out.
and sometimes they just picked them out by hand. And when that didn't work, they just used it anyway. People made biscuits, pancakes, or bread with bug-infested flour and ate it without complaint, or at least without too much complaint. Some pioneers even joked that the bugs were just extra protein. Diaries from the time show how attitudes shifted. At the start of the trip, travelers were horrified by the idea of eating anything with bugs in it. By the middle of the journey, they were just glad to have something to put in their stomachs. Hunger has a way of lowering your standards. Sometimes the flour was so far gone that it had to be mixed with cleaner flour just to be usable. Other times people had to wash and dry it before using it, which was a lot of extra work when you were already exhausted from a day's march. But even then, you could never get every bug out. And yes, eating bug flour sometimes made people sick, especially if the flour was moldy or rancid. But most of the time, people just powered through it. Food poisoning was considered better than starvation. On the Oregon Trail, nothing went to waste. You didn't complain about a little extra crunch in your biscuit. You just said thank you that there was anything to eat at all. Bugs and all.
Rancid coffee. Imagine waking up after a freezing, miserable night on the trail, stiff from sleeping on the ground, and all you want is one thing: coffee. You dig into your supply, brew a pot, and the smell hits you. Sour, musty, like wet socks left in a barrel. And then you drink it anyway. Coffee was one of the few luxuries pioneers had on the Oregon Trail. It wasn't just a drink, it was morale in a cup. After hours of walking, pushing wagons, and dealing with constant danger, coffee was the one small comfort that made life feel normal. That's why travelers packed barrels or sacks of coffee beans before leaving civilization. But those beans had to survive weeks or months in wagons, exposed to heat, dust, and worst of all, damp weather. Moisture was the enemy. When coffee beans or grounds got damp, they molded. Sometimes they turned slimy or smelled sour. Other times, they just went stale and tasted like dirt. But throwing them out wasn't an option. Coffee was too valuable, and there was no stopping at the next town for a fresh bag. So, people drank it, mold or no mold. Some pioneers tried to fix it by roasting the beans again over the fire, hoping to kill the mold and get a little flavor back. Others mixed the bad beans with cleaner ones, if they had them, to dilute the taste. But sometimes there was no hiding it. The coffee tasted like ditch water, and everyone grimaced through it. Diaries from the trail are full of complaints about coffee gone bad. Some travelers joked that their coffee was so awful it could walk off by itself. Others admitted that it upset their stomach, but said it was still better than facing a day without caffeine. When coffee ran out completely, some made desperate substitutes: roasted grains, chicory root, or even burnt corn, anything to mimic that bitter flavor they craved. Bad coffee wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a mental one. That cup in the morning was one of the only small pleasures left in a life of endless walking and danger.
Losing it, or finding it undrinkable, felt like losing a piece of home. And yet most people drank it anyway, mold and all. Because on the Oregon Trail, comfort wasn't about perfection. It was about survival. If a cup of rancid coffee gave you the strength to walk another 15 miles that day, you swallowed it, made a face, and kept going. On the trail, even coffee, that modern symbol of cozy mornings, was a gamble. It could taste terrible, make you sick, or give you just enough energy to survive one more brutal day. And for most pioneers, that was worth every bitter, moldy sip. Buffalo disappearance. Early pioneers saw buffalo herds so massive they blocked the horizon. Later travelers saw nothing but grass. When the first wagon trains crossed the Great Plains, they wrote about herds of buffalo so large that it took hours for them to pass. These animals weren't just a sight to behold, they were a vital food source. A single buffalo could feed an entire family for days, and hunting them was one of the few ways pioneers could get fresh meat on the trail. But that abundance didn't last. As more settlers, traders, and hunters moved west, the buffalo were slaughtered in staggering numbers. Professional hunters killed them by the thousands for hides, tongues, or sport, leaving the rest of the carcass to rot. Railroad expansion made it even worse. Passengers shot buffalo from train windows for entertainment, sometimes wiping out entire herds in a single afternoon. By the time many later wagon trains came through, the great herds were gone. Travelers who had heard stories of endless buffalo found empty grasslands instead. Hunting, once a reliable backup plan, became almost impossible. That meant relying more heavily on the food they had brought. Barrels of bacon, sacks of flour, beans, which might already be spoiled or moldy or infested with bugs by this point in the journey. This created a slow burn crisis. Without fresh meat, people got weaker. Children grew sick from poor nutrition. Families were forced to ration what little they had, sometimes down to a handful of flour per day. Some wagon trains ended up butchering their oxen or horses just to survive, sacrificing the very animals they needed to pull their wagons. And the problem went beyond hunger. The disappearance of buffalo also devastated Native American tribes, whose entire way of life depended on them. With no buffalo to hunt, some tribes faced famine and displacement. This led to increased conflict with settlers and wagon trains as tribes tried to protect what was left of their hunting grounds. For pioneers, the psychological blow was huge. They had been promised that the West was full of food, fertile land, endless game, and instead they were staring at miles of empty prairie with nothing to eat. Diaries describe the frustration of seeing no animals for days, then spotting a single antelope or rabbit and fighting over who got to hunt it. The vanishing buffalo herds turned what was supposed to be an opportunity into a gamble for survival. If you miscalculated your rations or couldn't find enough game, you didn't just go hungry, you risked never reaching Oregon at all. On the Oregon Trail, the empty horizon wasn't just eerie. It was a warning that the West was changing fast, and if you weren't prepared, it could starve you before you ever saw your new home. Starvation at end of season. By the end of the trail, some pioneers were so hungry they boiled their own shoe leather and ate it. Timing was everything on the Oregon Trail. Leave too early, and spring floods could trap you before you even got started. Leave too late, and you risked running out of food before you ever saw Oregon. For many unlucky wagon trains, the math just didn't work out. Delays from illness, broken wagons, lost cattle, or early snowstorms left them crawling toward the finish line with empty barrels. Starvation didn't hit all at once. At first, families cut portions in half. Then they started skipping meals so children could have the last scraps. Soon, even the kids went hungry. Travelers wrote about counting out the last crackers and praying they'd find game or reach a fort before they were gone. But sometimes there was nothing left to count. That's when the desperation started. People slaughtered their oxen and horses, trading transportation for meat. Others dug up bones from earlier meals, cracking them open to boil for marrow soup. Candles made from animal tallow became dinner. And yes, they even boiled leather harnesses and shoes, scraping off the softened strips and choking them down for a few miserable calories. Hunger didn't just make people weak. It broke their spirits. Some were too exhausted to walk and collapsed by the trail. Others grew irritable and hopeless, fighting with fellow travelers over scraps of food or refusing to share. Wagon trains were sometimes forced to abandon the weakest members just to keep moving. And hunger made everything else worse. When you're malnourished, even a small cut can turn into an infection. Your body can't fight disease, so dysentery, cholera, and typhoid hit harder. People became skeleton thin, their strength gone, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. Even for those who survived, reaching Oregon late in the season wasn't a happy ending. Many arrived too late to plant crops, meaning they faced a winter with no way to grow food. Some had to rely on charity from earlier settlers, trading away possessions or labor just to stay alive through the cold months. Starvation was one of the cruelest fates on the trail, because it stretched out the suffering day by day. There was no quick disaster, no single moment to fight through. It was just hunger grinding you down until there was nothing left but willpower. And for some, even that gave out. For the pioneers who boiled leather and chewed it like food, survival was never guaranteed. They walked into Oregon gaunt, haunted, and forever changed by what they'd done to stay alive. Alkaline water poisoning. Some water holes on the Oregon Trail didn't just taste bad, they poisoned the people desperate enough to drink from them. Water was life on the trail. Every wagon train carefully rationed what they carried in barrels, because running out between rivers could mean death. But sometimes, when they finally found a water source after a scorching day, the relief turned into horror. Parts of the Oregon Trail crossed alkaline deserts, stretches of land where the only available water was loaded with dissolved minerals like sodium carbonate. At first glance, these water holes looked safe enough. Still pools reflecting the sky, maybe even with animals nearby. But one sip told a different story. The water tasted bitter, almost soapy. Some travelers spat it out immediately. Others drank anyway because thirst was worse than the taste. And that's when the sickness started. Within hours, people were doubled over with stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. Severe cases left travelers delirious and too weak to walk. Dehydration set in quickly, which was especially dangerous in the heat of the desert. In some cases, people died simply because there was no other clean water within reach to rehydrate them. Even livestock suffered. Cattle and oxen often refused to drink the alkaline water at all, a bad sign for the travelers who depended on them. Some pioneers learned to watch the animals first. If they wouldn't touch the water, neither should you. But that left families in a terrible position. Keep marching and risk heat stroke, or drink and risk poisoning. People tried everything to make bad water drinkable. Some dug shallow wells near the alkaline pools, hoping to tap into cleaner groundwater just below the surface. Others filtered the water through cloth or mixed it with whiskey to cover the taste. Most of the time, it barely helped. Being sick from bad water slowed the entire wagon train. Families had to stop and let the sick recover, burning through valuable daylight and supplies. Sometimes people were too weak to keep up when the wagon train moved on, forcing them to travel alone or risk being left behind. The psychological toll was just as punishing. After one bad experience, travelers became paranoid about every water hole they came across. Diaries describe arguments in camp about whether to drink or wait for a better source, even when everyone was thirsty enough to risk collapse. Water wasn't optional on the Oregon Trail. It was survival. But in the alkaline deserts, the thing you needed most could leave you more dehydrated than before. For many travelers, each sip was a gamble, and the price of losing could be your life. Lead poisoning from cooking gear. The very pots pioneers used to cook their food may have been slowly poisoning them. Most pioneers cooked with tin or cast iron kettles that were soldered with lead. At the time, no one thought twice about it. Lead solder was cheap, easy to work with, and widely used in cookware. But on the trail, those kettles saw heavy use. Meals were often acidic stews, coffee, or soups that simmered for hours over open fires. And acidic foods are especially good at pulling lead right out of solder and into whatever you're about to eat. Lead poisoning doesn't hit all at once. The symptoms creep in gradually, which is why many pioneers probably didn't realize what was happening. At first, there might be stomach cramps or constipation, which most people wrote off as trail sickness. Then came fatigue, irritability, and headaches, easy to blame on walking 15 miles a day. But as exposure built up, symptoms got worse. Confusion, memory problems, even seizures. Children were hit hardest. Lead damages the nervous system, and kids absorb it more than adults do. Families may have watched their children become increasingly weak or sickly without understanding that it was their very cookware making them ill. Some travelers even commented in diaries about metallic-tasting food or drinks, which may have been an early sign of lead contamination. Others complained of mysterious stomach pain that wouldn't go away, or whole families falling ill with the same strange symptoms. Lead poisoning wouldn't necessarily kill someone outright, but it weakened them, slowed them down, and made them more vulnerable to other dangers on the trail. A family dealing with chronic fatigue or neurological issues would have been at a serious disadvantage crossing rivers, climbing mountains, or defending themselves from accidents or attacks. Historians believe that lead exposure from cookware and water barrels could have contributed to the overall death toll on the Oregon Trail. It wasn't as obvious as a cholera outbreak or a snake bite, but over time it chipped away at pioneers' health. The cruelest part is that no one had any idea what was happening. Lead poisoning wouldn't be widely understood until decades later, so pioneers just thought they were unlucky or naturally sickly. They kept cooking in the same pots day after day, unaware they were slowly dosing themselves with heavy metal. On the Oregon Trail, every meal was a victory, something to keep you alive another day. But for some travelers, every meal was also quietly shortening their life, one spoonful at a time. Oxen dying from larkspur poisoning. Sometimes the greenest, freshest grass on the trail was actually a death trap, and the oxen paid the price. Oxen were the lifeline of a wagon train. They pulled the wagons, carried the supplies, and quite literally made the journey possible. Without them, your wagon was nothing more than a very heavy storage shed sitting on wheels. That's why losing an ox was a big deal, and why losing an entire team could end your trip altogether. One of the deadliest threats to oxen wasn't wolves, exhaustion, or starvation. It was a flower. Larkspur, a tall plant with bright purple blossoms, grows along parts of the Oregon Trail. It's pretty to look at, but it's also packed with toxic alkaloids that can kill cattle quickly. Hungry oxen didn't know the difference between safe grass and poisonous weeds, especially early in the season when edible plants were sparse. Travelers would sometimes let their animals graze overnight, only to wake up in the morning to find them staggering, bloated, or lying dead in the grass. Larkspur poisoning acts fast, causing muscle weakness, tremors, difficulty breathing, and eventually paralysis. A perfectly healthy ox could drop dead in just a few hours. The loss wasn't just sad, it was catastrophic. A wagon team usually needed 4 to 6 oxen to pull the heavy load. If even one died, the others had to work harder. If 2 or 3 went down, you might have to abandon the wagon entirely, taking only what you could carry or load into other wagons, if anyone had room. Some pioneers butchered their dead oxen for meat to avoid wasting the carcasses. That might solve dinner for a few nights, but it didn't solve the bigger problem. Now you had no way to pull your supplies. People sometimes had to throw out furniture, trunks, or even barrels of food just to make the wagon light enough for fewer animals to pull. Wagon trains quickly learned to watch for patches of suspicious plants and keep their animals away, but it wasn't always possible. There were nights when the best grazing land was also the most dangerous, and with tired animals and limited daylight, herding them somewhere safer wasn't always an option. Diaries from the time describe the devastation of losing animals this way. Men cursing, women crying, entire camps delayed for hours as they rearranged teams and redistributed supplies. A single plant could mean the difference between making it to Oregon or never leaving the prairie. On the Oregon Trail, the danger wasn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it was hiding in plain sight, a patch of green that looked like salvation, but ended your journey before it really began.
Food theft by wolves or coyotes. Pioneers didn't just worry about hunting for food. They had to fight to keep the food they already had. Food was the most precious cargo on the Oregon Trail. Every pound of bacon, every sack of flour was carefully measured before the trip began. Families calculated exactly how much they'd need to survive the months-long journey. But none of that mattered if you woke up to find it had been stolen in the night. Wolves, coyotes, and even feral dogs were constant visitors to wagon camps. The smell of bacon grease, dried meat, or even scraps from dinner could draw them in from miles away. Travelers sometimes woke to the sound of growling and the sight of glowing eyes at the edge of the firelight. By morning, they might find torn sacks, tipped barrels, and missing food. Losing supplies wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. Food lost early in the journey could mean starvation weeks later. There were no grocery stores, no backup plan. If a pack of wolves dragged off your bacon, you either went hungry or cut your rations for the rest of the trip. Coyotes were clever thieves. They could slip silently into camp, grab whatever they could carry, and be gone before anyone woke up. Wolves were bolder, sometimes coming close enough to scare the livestock or even attack sick or weak animals. If they spooked the oxen, it could lead to a stampede, causing even more chaos and loss. Travelers had to get creative to protect their food. Some hung meat from wagon tongues or tree branches to keep it out of reach. Others buried food or kept it inside wagons overnight. Campfires were kept burning as a deterrent, and at least one person might stay awake on guard duty, rifle in hand. But guards could fall asleep, fires could burn out, and predators only had to get lucky once. There are diary entries describing camps that woke to disaster. Food scattered across the ground, leather bags chewed through, and entire families left with barely enough rations to last a few days. Some groups responded by hunting down the predators, but ammunition was precious, and wolves weren't always easy to catch. And sometimes the thieves weren't even wild animals. Stray dogs from other wagon trains, or even desperate fellow travelers, could sneak in and take food when no one was looking. Every loss made tempers flare, sometimes leading to fights between families over who was responsible. On the Oregon Trail, hunger was a constant threat. Losing food to a pack of wolves wasn't just a bad night. It could mean the difference between reaching Oregon or becoming another grave by the side of the road. Moldy hardtack. Trail rations were so tough they could break your teeth, and sometimes they were moldy on top of it. Hardtack was one of the most common foods on the Oregon Trail. It was just flour, water, and salt, baked until it was so dry it could last for months without spoiling. In theory, that made it perfect trail food. In practice, it made mealtime a battle. Fresh hardtack was already hard as a rock, but after weeks in a wagon, exposed to heat,
moisture and insects, it often got worse. Some pieces grew mold, others turned damp and crumbly, or became infested with weevils and worms. When travelers opened a barrel and saw the green fuzz, they usually didn't throw it out. They just scraped off the mold and ate it anyway. Eating hardtack wasn't easy. People smashed it with rifle butts to break it into smaller chunks, then soaked it in coffee, soup, or even water just to make it chewable. The nickname teeth dullers came from the number of people who actually cracked teeth trying to bite into them dry. And breaking a tooth wasn't just painful. On the trail, an infected tooth could be a death sentence if it turned into a serious infection. Even when it wasn't moldy, hardtack tasted bland at best. Some pioneers joked that it was so hard you could use it to hammer nails, or that it would stop a bullet if you wore it as armor. Others called the worms long raisins and just ate them along with the biscuit. After all, extra protein was extra protein. But jokes aside, hardtack was survival. If you ran out of it, you were in trouble. Families depended on those little bricks of flour for the bulk of their calories. Losing a barrel of hardtack in a river crossing could mean weeks of hunger. And sometimes eating it wasn't optional. It was the only choice. Even if it tasted off or made you queasy, it was better than going to bed on an empty stomach after walking 15 miles. People learned to ignore the smell, pick out the bugs if they had time, and just choke it down. There are diary entries describing how demoralizing it was to end a long day with a moldy, tooth-breaking biscuit as your only meal. But at the same time, those same diaries often thank that hardtack for keeping them alive long enough to make it to the next fort or hunting ground. Hardtack was the perfect symbol of the Oregon Trail. Simple, unglamorous, and brutally hard, just like the journey itself.
Wagon axle breaks. When a wagon axle snapped, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could decide whether you made it to Oregon at all. Wagon axles were the weak point of every pioneer journey. They carried thousands of pounds of supplies over uneven trails, through mud, sand, rivers, and rocky mountain passes. Every creak and groan was a reminder that if one piece of wood gave out, your entire trip could grind to a halt. Axles didn't politely wait to break near a fort or a blacksmith shop. They broke miles from help, in the middle of nowhere, often at the worst possible moment, right before a river crossing, at the base of a mountain, or with night falling. When that happened, the wagon stopped where it stood, and everyone's first thought was the same. How do we fix this before we're stranded? Most families didn't have spare axles. They were heavy and took up valuable wagon space. So repairs had to be improvised. Travelers scavenged fallen trees, broke apart wagon beds, smashed crates, or even burned their own furniture to get useful wood. Then came the hard work of carving and fitting a new axle by hand with basic tools. This wasn't a quick fix. Some repairs took hours, others days, leaving the wagon train stuck in one place. That meant burning through food supplies,
risking illness from staying near the same water source, and exposing everyone to bad weather or potential raids. The pressure was intense. Every minute lost meant arriving later in the season, and late arrival could mean running into early snow in the mountains. Even a successful repair didn't always hold. A hand-carved axle might crack again after just a few miles. Some travelers had to repair the same wagon multiple times on the same trip, gradually running out of wood and energy. If all else failed, the family had to abandon the wagon entirely, taking only what they could carry or load onto other wagons. Diaries describe the frustration and heartbreak of these moments. Men cursed and sweated over broken wheels, while women and children sat by the roadside, watching precious time slip away. Sometimes other wagons stayed to help, but not always. Some wagon trains couldn't afford to lose a day and simply moved on, leaving the unlucky family to catch up if they could. A broken axle could mean the difference between reaching Oregon with enough supplies to start a new life, or arriving with nothing but the clothes on your back. It was one of the most dreaded sounds on the trail. The sharp crack of wood under too much strain, because everyone knew what came next. Hard labor, lost time, and the risk of being left behind.
Oxen hoof rot. The Oregon Trail could grind to a halt, not because of broken wagons, but because the oxen's feet gave out. Oxen were the heart of the wagon train. Without them, the wagons were useless. But day after day, those animals pulled thousands of pounds over rocky trails, through mud, across rivers, and in blazing heat. Their hooves took a beating, and when those hooves got damaged or infected, the entire journey was suddenly in danger. Hoof rot, also called foot rot, was a bacterial infection that thrived in wet, dirty conditions. All it took was a small crack in the hoof or a cut from a sharp rock for the bacteria to get inside. Soon the hoof would swell, smell foul, and become so painful that the ox refused to walk. One lame ox was bad enough. The others had to work harder to make up the difference. 2 or 3 lame animals could stop a wagon in its tracks. That left pioneers with a terrible choice: wait for the oxen to recover, which could take days, or find a way to keep moving without them. Treatment on the trail was primitive. Travelers had to flip the oxen's feet up, clean out the hoof, and apply pine tar, spirits, or whatever medicine they could improvise. Sometimes the animals had to rest for days, which meant the wagon train lost precious time. Other times there was no choice but to butcher the sick animal for meat, leaving the family with fewer draft animals and a much heavier workload. When too many oxen went lame, families had to make heartbreaking decisions. They lightened wagons by throwing out furniture, clothes, or even food, just to make them light enough for fewer animals to pull. In extreme cases, men, women, and even children put themselves in the harness and tried to pull the wagon forward by hand. Back-breaking work under the prairie sun. Diaries describe nights spent sitting by the fire, tending to oxen hooves, praying they'd be able to walk in the morning.
Some pioneers even made makeshift shoes or wrapped the animals' feet with rags to give them extra protection. It was a constant struggle, and every mile risked reopening the injury. The psychological weight was heavy. A single case of hoof rot could delay the train long enough to throw off the schedule, leaving everyone at risk of hitting mountain passes too late and being trapped by snow. Families feared the sound of limping hooves almost as much as they feared storms or cholera. On the Oregon Trail, the journey wasn't just about surviving disease and hunger. It was about keeping the very animals that pulled you alive and moving, because if their feet failed, your entire future could be left behind in the mud.
Wheel shrinkage. A wagon didn't need to crash or tip to become useless. Sometimes the sun itself destroyed it. Wagon wheels were a marvel of frontier engineering. They were made of tough, carefully fitted wooden spokes and rims, all held together by a heated iron band that shrank tightly around the wood as it cooled. When the wheels were fresh, they were solid and strong. But the Oregon Trail wasn't kind to them. On the open prairie, the sun beat down all day with no shade for miles. The heat dried out the wooden wheels until they began to shrink. As the wood contracted, the iron rim loosened, sometimes slipping right off the wheel. Without the metal rim holding it together, the wheel could wobble, collapse, or fall apart completely. This didn't just cause a delay, it could strand a family in the middle of nowhere. A wagon with a broken or missing wheel couldn't be moved, and leaving it behind often meant abandoning food, tools, and supplies needed to survive the rest of the trip. Repairs weren't simple. To fix a loose wheel, travelers had to either soak the wood in water to make it swell again, or heat the iron rim in a fire so it expanded enough to fit back on. That meant finding enough water or firewood, both of which could be scarce on the plains. Some families soaked wheels overnight in rivers or creeks, waiting until morning to try fitting them again. Others heated rims over campfires and hammered them back into place with whatever tools they had. This process was hot, exhausting work, often done under the blazing sun. While the repair dragged on, the wagon train either waited, burning precious daylight, or moved on, leaving the stranded family to catch up later if they could. Even when the repair worked, there was no guarantee it would hold. Some wheels shrank again after just a few days, forcing repeated stops and repairs. And if the wheel broke completely, the family was in trouble. Spare wheels were rare because they were heavy and took up space, and not every wagon train had a blacksmith or wheelwright traveling with them. Diaries from the time describe the frustration of losing hours, even days, trying to fix wheels that had fallen apart simply from the heat. One broken wheel could delay an entire group, throwing off schedules and risking late arrival to mountain passes. It was a cruel irony. The same sun that lit the way west was also slowly dismantling the wagons piece by piece. For some pioneers, the journey ended not with a dramatic disaster, but with the quiet, stubborn problem of a wheel that just wouldn't stay together.
Runaway wagons. A steep downhill stretch could turn a wagon from your lifeline into a speeding death trap. Wagons were built to be sturdy, but they were heavy. Thousands of pounds of wood, iron, food, tools, and personal belongings. Going downhill with that much weight wasn't just tricky, it was one of the most dangerous parts of the Oregon Trail. If the wagon got away from you, it became a battering ram on wheels. Pioneers had to prepare carefully before descending a steep slope. They locked wooden brakes into place, chained wheels so they wouldn't spin freely, and sometimes tied logs or even entire trees behind the wagon to act as a drag. It was exhausting work, but necessary, because if those measures failed, the wagon would start rolling faster and faster, dragging the oxen behind it and leaving everyone scrambling to get out of the way. Once a wagon started to run, stopping it was almost impossible. The weight worked against you. The faster it went, the more momentum it built up, until it was barreling downhill like a runaway train. Oxen teams were sometimes thrown off their feet, trampled under the wagon they were pulling. Families inside were tossed around like rag dolls. The worst-case scenario was a full tip-over. A runaway wagon could hit a rock or rut and flip, crushing anyone underneath. Diaries from the trail mention grisly scenes where riders were killed instantly, pinned under broken wheels, or maimed by falling gear. Survivors then had to salvage what they could from the wreckage, often while grieving the loss of family members. Even if no one was hurt, a runaway wagon could scatter supplies everywhere, breaking barrels and ruining food. That could leave a family with nothing to eat for the rest of the trip. And every minute spent recovering meant falling further behind the wagon train. Some pioneers were so afraid of this happening that they unloaded their wagons completely and carried the supplies down the hill by hand before guiding the empty wagon down. This took hours, sometimes days, but it was safer than risking everything in a single uncontrolled ride. Wagon trains learned to work together on steep grades, using ropes and teams of men to slow the descent. Still, accidents happened. A single broken chain or loose brake could send a wagon out of control, turning a careful descent into a nightmare. Runaway wagons were one of those dangers that struck without warning. 1 second you were guiding your team carefully downhill. The next you were running for your life. On the Oregon Trail, survival meant respecting gravity, because losing control on a hill could cost you your wagon, your supplies, and even your life.
Sinking wagons in rivers. One bad river crossing could erase months of preparation, and sometimes take lives along with the supplies. Rivers were some of the most feared obstacles on the Oregon Trail. There were no bridges for most of the route, and ferries were often scarce or too expensive for families to afford. That meant fording the river, driving a wagon straight through and hoping for the best. A wagon weighed thousands of pounds, and when you added people, food, tools, and animals, it became even heavier. Oxen had to push through rushing water while keeping the wagon upright. But if the current was too strong, the bottom too soft, or the crossing too deep, things could go wrong fast. If a wagon tipped or got stuck midstream, water poured in almost instantly. A waterlogged wagon became almost impossible to pull out. The current could drag it downstream, flip it over, or smash it against rocks. everything inside was soaked or swept away. Flour turned to paste, bacon floated off, and clothes and tools were lost forever. And sometimes it wasn't just supplies that went under. Families sometimes stayed inside the wagon to stay dry during crossings. If the wagon sank, those passengers could be trapped, dragged down, and drowned before anyone could reach them. Diaries from the trail are filled with heartbreaking accounts of children, even entire families, lost in river accidents. Survivors faced an awful decision. Do you wait and try to salvage what you can from the river, losing valuable daylight and risking another storm? Or do you leave it all behind and push on, knowing you may not have enough food or gear to finish the trip? Either choice came with consequences. Some pioneers tried to make their wagons more boat-like by caulking the seams with tar or grease and floating them across. When this worked, it was brilliant. When it failed, the wagon tipped and everything was lost in seconds. Others paid ferrymen or built makeshift rafts, but those too could capsize under the weight. A bad crossing could devastate an entire wagon train. If several wagons sank, it could mean food shortages for everyone. It also took a huge emotional toll. Months of careful planning and packing gone in a single afternoon. River crossings weren't just another obstacle. They were a gamble. Every time pioneers reached a river, they had to weigh the risk, wait for a safer crossing and lose precious time, or go now and risk losing everything. For many, the Oregon Trail ended in the middle of a river, with their wagons and hopes sinking out of sight.
Firearms exploding. On the trail, your gun wasn't always your friend. Sometimes it blew up in your hands. Guns were a lifeline on the Oregon Trail. Families depended on them to hunt game, scare off predators, and protect themselves. But not every pioneer had a shiny new rifle. Many brought along old muskets that had seen better days, or cheaply made weapons that weren't built for constant use in rain, dust, and heat. Black powder firearms were notoriously finicky. They had to be loaded carefully, measure the powder, seat the ball just right, and make sure the barrel was clean. But the trail didn't leave much time for precision. People were tired, rushed, and often careless. One of the most dangerous mistakes was double charging, accidentally loading too much powder. The extra pressure could burst the barrel like a bomb. When a gun exploded, the results were gruesome. The barrel could split open, sending shards of metal into the shooter's hands, arms, or face. Fingers could be blown off. Hot powder could blind or severely burn someone. In some cases, the stock splintered and impaled the shooter with sharp wood fragments. And it wasn't just bad loading that caused accidents. Rust, dents, and cracks weakened barrels until they gave way under normal use. Wet powder could misfire and force people to reprime and fire multiple times, which increased the chance of something going wrong. Some guns were dropped and discharged while being picked up, hitting their owners or bystanders. Black powder itself was a hazard. It was kept in powder horns or kegs, and one stray spark near the fire could ignite it. There are accounts of powder kegs blowing up and killing or maiming everyone nearby. A single mistake could leave a wagon train short on weapons, ammunition, and manpower. Losing a gun was more than just losing a tool. It meant losing your ability to hunt for food or defend yourself. A wounded shooter could no longer help with wagon work, making the entire group slower and more vulnerable. Diaries from the trail warn repeatedly about gun safety. Some travelers refused to let children near firearms because of the risk of accidental discharge. Others told stories of neighbors losing fingers or entire hands from bursting barrels. The message was clear. Every shot carried a risk. For pioneers, guns were both security and danger. They brought down buffalo, but they also sent people to early graves when something went wrong. On the Oregon Trail, even the thing meant to keep you alive could turn against you in an instant with one deafening, bone-shattering blast.
Accidental discharges. The most dangerous shooter on the Oregon Trail wasn't an outlaw. It was your neighbor with a loaded gun. Firearms were everywhere on the trail. Every wagon carried at least one, sometimes several. They were meant for protection and hunting, but most pioneers weren't expert marksmen. Many had barely handled a gun before setting out west. And when you put hundreds of tired, stressed, inexperienced people in close quarters with loaded weapons, accidents were bound to happen. Accidental discharges were one of the most common ways people were injured or killed on the Oregon Trail. More people were shot by mistake than in any actual fight or attack. Diaries are full of grim notes about travelers who were hit by bullets meant for nothing at all. The causes were almost always the same: carelessness and fatigue. People climbed into wagons with rifles cocked. Children played with guns left leaning against wagon wheels. Men tripped on uneven ground and fired their weapons by accident. Sometimes someone tried to clear a jammed musket or reload in a hurry, only to set it off unexpectedly. Close quarters made these accidents even more deadly. Wagon trains traveled with everyone bunched together, wagons in a line, people walking alongside, livestock nearby. When a gun went off, there was almost always someone close enough to be hit. And in a time before advanced medicine, even a wound that might not be fatal today could kill from blood loss or infection. The victims weren't just strangers. Sometimes it was family. There are heartbreaking accounts of children shot while playing near camp, women hit by stray bullets while cooking, and fathers accidentally shooting their own sons while hunting. The psychological toll was immense, with survivors blaming themselves for the rest of their lives. Wagon trains eventually began enforcing strict rules about firearms. Some required all guns to be unloaded while traveling, only loading them in camp or when hunting. But not everyone followed the rules, and accidents kept happening. Even when no one was killed, a gun accident could cripple someone and slow the entire group. A wounded man might need to be carried in a wagon, using up space and resources. The wagon train had to stop to treat the injury, burning precious daylight. Every delay increased the risk of running out of food or hitting snow in the mountains.
Ironically, the guns that were meant to make pioneers feel safe were one of the most dangerous things in camp. People worried as much about where their neighbors were pointing their rifles as they did about wild animals or raiders. On the Oregon Trail, death didn't always come from the wilderness. Sometimes it came from the careless hands of the very people you were traveling with.
Gunpowder getting wet. A single rainstorm could turn a wagon full of rifles into nothing more than heavy sticks. On the Oregon Trail, gunpowder was as important as food or water. Without it, you couldn't hunt for fresh meat, scare off wolves, or defend your family if someone tried to rob you. Black powder was the heart of every firearm, and it had one deadly weakness: it hated moisture. Gunpowder had to stay bone dry to work. Even damp air could make it clump, and a single drop of water could ruin a whole powder charge. That meant every rainstorm, every river crossing, and every spilled barrel of drinking water was a potential disaster. If powder got wet, it was useless until it could be dried. A wet charge wouldn't ignite properly. It would fizzle, smoke, or do nothing at all. In some cases, it could even clog the barrel and cause the next shot to explode the gun in the shooter's face. For settlers, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. Travelers learned to protect their powder like gold. Powder horns were kept sealed tight. Kegs were wrapped in canvas, tucked inside wagons, and checked constantly. When rain clouds rolled in, people scrambled to cover everything before a single drop could get through. Despite all that, accidents still happened. Diaries tell of wagons tipping in rivers, soaking powder kegs, and ruining every cartridge. Other travelers wrote about nights when a surprise thunderstorm left them scrambling under the wagon in the dark, trying to keep their supplies dry. The next morning was spent laying powder out in the sun, hoping to salvage at least some of it, and praying no spark or stray ember from the campfire set it off. While powder dried, pioneers were effectively defenseless. They could hear wolves at night and do nothing but keep the fire burning and hope it kept predators away. If an attack came from raiders or thieves, there was no way to fire back. Wet powder also meant no hunting, and no hunting meant no fresh meat to stretch food supplies. For some families, a wet keg meant living off moldy hardtack and beans until they reached the next fort or trading post, if they had enough left to trade. Keeping your powder dry wasn't just a saying, it was survival. A single careless moment could turn a loaded rifle into a useless stick and leave a family vulnerable for days. On the Oregon Trail, you could be prepared for floods, disease, even stampedes. But if your powder got wet, you might as well have been walking unarmed into the wilderness.
No blacksmiths for repairs. On the trail, when something broke, there was no friendly blacksmith waiting. You were the blacksmith. Wagons, wheels, and tools were under constant stress on the Oregon Trail. The heavy loads rattled over miles of rocky terrain, splashed through rivers, sank into mud, and got baked under the summer sun. Breakdowns weren't a rare inconvenience. They were inevitable. But there was no town nearby, no workshop, no forge. If something failed, you had to fix it yourself or risk losing everything. Families carried whatever tools they could fit: hatchets, knives, saws, and maybe a hammer. When a wagon tongue snapped or a wheel pin sheared off, those were the tools they had to work with. Metal parts were bent back into shape over a campfire. Nails were straightened and reused. Leather harnesses were patched with rawhide. Broken wheels were tied together with rope until a proper repair could be made, hopefully at the next fort. But improvised fixes didn't always hold. A wagon tongue repaired with a crude wooden splint might snap again on the next steep hill. A wheel lashed together with leather could fall apart in the middle of a river crossing, dumping everything and everyone into the current. Every fix was a gamble. Some wagon trains were lucky enough to have a blacksmith traveling with them, hauling a small anvil and bellows in the wagon. But most couldn't afford the extra weight or space. That meant repairs were done by tired farmers, not skilled tradesmen, and mistakes could be costly. Diaries from the trail are full of desperate repair attempts: carving replacement axles by firelight, hammering nails flat with a rock, melting down bits of scrap metal to fashion new pins. Sometimes repairs took hours or even days, forcing the wagon train to stop and wait, wasting precious daylight and risking being caught by early snow in the mountains. When a repair couldn't be made at all, the choices were grim. Families had to lighten their wagons by throwing out furniture, clothes, even food, just to make them light enough for fewer wheels or oxen to pull. In the worst cases, the wagon was abandoned entirely, and the family walked the rest of the way, carrying what they could on their backs. Every creak of the wagon became a warning sign. People learned to listen for trouble: a squealing axle, a rattling pin, a groaning wheel hub, because they knew that if something broke too badly to fix, their dream of reaching Oregon might die right there on the prairie. On the Oregon Trail, survival wasn't just about staying healthy. It was about being able to fix anything with whatever you had on hand. Every repair was a fight against time, distance, and bad luck. And sometimes, despite all your work, the trail still won.
Overloaded wagons. Some pioneers tried to take their whole house to Oregon, and the trail made them pay for it. When families left for the Oregon Trail, they didn't just bring food and tools. They brought everything they thought they'd need for their new lives. Trunks full of clothes, cast iron stoves, china sets, clocks, even pianos. Many of them had never traveled far from home, and they imagined they'd want all the comforts of civilization waiting for them in Oregon. But wagons weren't built for comfort. A typical prairie schooner could hold about 2,000 pounds of supplies before the wheels and axles were at risk. Many families loaded far more than that. The result? Wagons groaned and creaked from the first mile. Oxen struggled to pull them, and breakdowns happened early, sometimes within the first few weeks of travel. When an axle or tongue snapped, there was no time to debate what to keep. Families had to lighten the load fast. Out went the extra clothes, the rocking chairs, the desks, the books, the keepsakes. The trail became littered with broken furniture, barrels, mattresses, and family heirlooms, a haunting reminder of how brutal the journey was. Guides and experienced scouts warned travelers about overloading before they even left Missouri, but many ignored the advice. They didn't want to part with anything before they had to. But as the miles dragged on and wagons sank into mud or snapped under the weight, reality hit. Even after throwing out their heaviest possessions, many families still suffered from the early strain. Oxen that had been pushed too hard sometimes died, leaving wagons without teams to pull them. Wheels that had been overloaded cracked more easily later, forcing constant repairs. And all that time lost to fixing broken wagons meant late arrivals at crucial points in the journey. Some travelers ended up ditching their wagons entirely and walking the rest of the way, carrying what little they could on their backs or loading supplies into other people's wagons if there was space. Those who couldn't find help sometimes had to turn back, their dreams of Oregon ending in piles of abandoned belongings scattered along the trail. Diaries from the time mention how eerie it was to travel past miles of discarded furniture and supplies, like a trail of lost hopes. One traveler even wrote that it looked as if civilization itself had been stripped away piece by piece. Overloading wasn't just a rookie mistake, it was a costly one. The trail punished those who tried to bring too much with them, forcing them to sacrifice comfort, keepsakes, and sometimes even the chance to finish the journey. On the Oregon Trail, the price of trying to take it all with you was learning, often the hard way, how to live with nothing.
Bandit gangs. Not every danger on the trail came from nature. Some of it was waiting with a loaded gun. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a road for hopeful pioneers. It was also a perfect hunting ground for outlaws. Small wagon parties, stragglers, and families who fell behind the main group made easy targets for bandits looking to steal food, animals, weapons, or even entire wagons. Bandits didn't usually attack in big cinematic shootouts. They relied on surprise. A few men could wait near a river crossing or in a stretch of remote prairie, then ride out when a small group passed by. Sometimes they just threatened travelers and took what they wanted. Other times, if the travelers resisted, things turned violent. Losing supplies to bandits was devastating. A single stolen team of oxen could make it impossible to pull a wagon, forcing a family to abandon most of their belongings. Stolen food meant weeks of hunger ahead, and losing weapons made a group more vulnerable to future attacks. To protect themselves, pioneers tried to stay in large wagon trains whenever possible. At night, wagons were often arranged in a circle with guards posted around the perimeter. Some groups even hired armed escorts or scouts specifically to keep watch for thieves.
But even with precautions, attacks still happened, especially in stretches of the trail where the landscape made ambush easy. Diaries from the time tell chilling stories of waking up to find livestock missing, wagons broken into, or strangers approaching camp at night. In some cases, travelers set out to track down the thieves, but most of the time there was nothing they could do, except keep moving and hope they had enough supplies left to make it to the next fort. There was always tension when strangers appeared on the horizon. Were they fellow travelers who needed help, or a gang looking for an easy mark? Some pioneers wrote that they kept rifles close at hand whenever anyone approached, just in case. Bandit attacks weren't as common as diseases or accidents, but the fear of them hung over every wagon train. People slept lightly, listening to hoofbeats in the dark. Every delay, every broken axle, every day spent camping too long in one spot felt like an invitation to trouble. The Oregon Trail is often remembered as a fight against the wilderness, but for some, the deadliest threat wasn't wild animals or raging rivers. It was other people, waiting in the shadows, ready to take everything you had worked to carry west.
Drunken violence in forts. Stopping at a fort was supposed to be a relief, but sometimes it was where the most dangerous fights happened. Forts along the Oregon Trail were lifelines. They were where pioneers could restock on flour, bacon, ammunition, and tools, make repairs to wagons, and get news about the road ahead. After weeks of nothing but endless prairie, reaching a fort felt like arriving in civilization. But civilization on the frontier came with its own set of risks. Forts weren't just supply posts, they were also gathering places for soldiers, fur traders, trappers, Native Americans, and other travelers. And when that many stressed, tired, and armed people were crammed together, tensions could rise fast. Add whiskey to the mix, and trouble wasn't far behind. Alcohol was one of the most popular trade goods at many forts, and wagon train members who had been walking for hundreds of miles were more than eager to blow off steam. But drunken arguments could flare up over almost anything: gambling games, horse trades, unpaid debts, or even insults shouted across a crowded room. Brawls sometimes erupted in the middle of the trading yard or inside saloons. Knives, bottles, and fists were all fair game, and guns occasionally came out when things got truly heated. Travelers recorded stories of men being stabbed, shot, or beaten so badly they couldn't continue the journey. A single fight could derail a wagon train schedule by days if it left someone wounded or dead. Diaries from the trail mentioned settlers complaining about rowdy behavior at forts, describing them as noisy, dangerous places after nightfall. Some forts stationed guards or soldiers to keep order, but with so many people coming and going, it wasn't always possible to prevent violence. These fights weren't just between strangers either. Members of the same wagon train sometimes turned on each other after months of built-up frustration. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, and long-standing grudges could explode in an instant, leaving families divided and groups forced to split. The worst part was how preventable it often was. Travelers survived flash floods, broken wagons, disease outbreaks, and food shortages, only to die in a drunken brawl over a card game or an overcharged sack of flour. For some, the most dangerous day of the entire journey wasn't out on the plains. It was the day they stopped to resupply. Stopping at a fort could be a moment of relief, but it was also a reminder that danger didn't always come from the wilderness. Sometimes it came from other desperate people, with too much whiskey in their system and nothing left to lose.
Wagon train mutinies. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a physical journey. Sometimes it turned into a political battlefield. Most wagon trains elected a leader before setting out. This person was responsible for setting the pace, deciding when to stop, choosing river crossings, and settling disputes between families. In theory, this kept everyone organized. In practice, it put one person in charge of dozens of other people's lives, and not everyone liked their decisions. Leadership on the trail was a tough job. Go too fast, and people got exhausted. Animals died, and wagons broke down. Go too slow, and the wagon train risked running out of food or hitting snow in the mountains. Every decision was life or death, and the longer the journey went on, the more criticism built up. Mutinies weren't always dramatic, but they were common. Sometimes members simply refused to follow the leader's orders, splitting from the main group and forming their own smaller train. Other times, the wagon train held a vote and replaced the leader outright. In a few cases, things got heated. Arguments turned into shouting matches, and leaders were literally abandoned on the trail as the rest of the group moved on without them. Diaries from the trail describe the tension that led to these moments. Accusations of favoritism, claims that leaders were too cautious or too reckless, or anger over poor route choices that caused delays. Some groups blamed their guides for every broken axle or lost ox and decided they could do better on their own. But splitting a wagon train was risky. Smaller groups had fewer people to stand guard at night, fewer rifles for protection, and fewer supplies to share if something went wrong. Some mutinies ended in tragedy when breakaway groups became lost or delayed and ran into starvation or early snow. The Donner Party is the most infamous example of this kind of division. Leadership disputes and bad route choices played a major role in their disaster. For the families involved, a mutiny could feel both liberating and terrifying. They were free of a leader they didn't trust, but they were also striking out into the unknown without the safety of numbers. It was a gamble that could mean a faster, safer trip or a death sentence. The Oregon Trail wasn't just about surviving nature. It was about surviving each other. Living, working, and traveling with the same group for months could turn even small disagreements into full-blown revolts. When people picture the trail, they imagine buffalo hunts, river crossings, and dusty wagons. But for many pioneers, the most intense drama happened inside the wagon train itself, where every decision could split the group, and mutiny was always one bad day away.
Disputes over water rights. On the Oregon Trail, water wasn't just precious, it was worth fighting over. Travelers could go days without seeing a good water source. When they finally found a creek, spring, or small pond, it wasn't just a relief, it was survival. But they weren't always the first ones there. Another wagon train might already be camped nearby, drawing water for their own animals. Suddenly, the quiet stream became the most contested piece of land for miles. Arguments broke out over who got to drink first, who had been waiting longer, and how much water each group was allowed to take. With dozens of oxen, mules, and cattle needing gallons each, a single water source could be drained before everyone had their turn. That meant some families had to wait or risk moving on with half-empty barrels, gambling that they'd find more water before thirst set in. Tensions could flare fast. Thirst makes people irritable, and on the trail, everyone was already tired and stressed. What started as an argument about whose livestock was drinking too much could turn into shouting, shoving, and even fistfights. Sometimes things got worse. Guns were never far from reach, and there are recorded cases of disputes over water ending in gunfire. A single shot could spark panic and force the entire wagon train to choose sides or split into smaller groups. Diaries mention families posting guards at night to make sure no one drove their animals away from the stream or blocked access to the water. Some travelers even wrote about poisoning or polluting water sources to deny them to rival groups, a desperate and dangerous act that risked retaliation. And water disputes didn't just happen between pioneers. Native tribes relied on many of the same streams and springs. When a large wagon train arrived and let its livestock trample and muddy the water, it could spark confrontations with the people whose land they were crossing. These clashes sometimes ended in standoffs or violence, leaving both sides worse off. The stakes were always high, because running out of water wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Without enough for people and animals, a wagon train could be stranded in the middle of the prairie with no way to keep going. Water wasn't just a resource, it was power. Whoever controlled the spring controlled survival. And on the Oregon Trail, survival was often worth fighting and killing for. Murder for supplies. On the trail, the line between neighbor and threat could disappear overnight, sometimes with deadly results. The Oregon Trail forced strangers to rely on one another. Families traveled together, shared campfires, and often shared food and tools when someone was in need. But when times got desperate, that spirit of cooperation could turn into fear and sometimes violence. Starvation, lost animals, broken wagons, and sickness could push people to the edge. Food was carefully rationed, and if a wagon train ran behind schedule, those rations started to run out. A family that was hungry enough might start eyeing their neighbor's supplies, wondering if sharing would be enough, or if taking everything was the only way they'd survive. There are accounts of travelers who were killed for their livestock, their wagons, or even just a barrel of flour. Some murders were obvious, bodies found near abandoned wagons or scattered belongings. Others were suspected but never proven, with whole families disappearing after camping with strangers.
The fear of being robbed or killed for supplies haunted many travelers. Diaries mention keeping weapons loaded at night and posting guards not just against wolves or raiders, but against fellow pioneers. Some groups became so distrustful that they refused to camp with anyone they didn't already know. When killers were caught, wagon trains often held trials right there on the prairie. Witnesses gave testimony. A jury was chosen from the travelers, and judgment was passed. Punishment could be hanging, shooting, or banishment, leaving the guilty party to fend for themselves on foot. For pioneers, justice had to be swift, because the wagon train couldn't wait. These murders weren't common compared to accidents or disease, but the possibility was always there. Every family knew that if they ran out of food, they might face the same terrible choice: beg for help, starve quietly, or take what they needed by force. Some historians believe more trail murders happened than we'll ever know. Isolated parties could vanish, leaving only a rumor behind. Others may have been killed and buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost to time. For travelers, this fear added another layer of stress to an already brutal journey. You had to worry about floods, cholera, starvation, and also about whether the people sitting around the fire with you might someday decide you were worth dead than alive. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a battle against nature. Sometimes it was a battle against human desperation and the terrible things it could make people do. Desertions. The Oregon Trail didn't just break wagons, it broke families. The journey west was more than just a test of endurance. It was a test of loyalty. Families traveled for months under constant stress. Hunger, heat, disease, and exhaustion wore everyone down. For some, the pressure became too much, and they made a choice that shocked everyone around them. They left. Desertion on the trail wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it happened quietly. A partner or older child simply walked away one morning, taking a horse or mule and vanishing down the road. Other times there were shouting matches, fights, or tearful arguments before someone stormed off, leaving the others to fend for themselves. The reasons were grim, but often understandable. Some partners left because they were convinced they'd never make it if they stayed. Traveling with sick children, broken wagons, or too much baggage slowed the whole party. By leaving, they could travel faster and lighter, but at a terrible cost to those left behind. Desertions could cripple a family's ability to keep going. A single wagon might need 2 or 3 people to handle animals, set up camp, and guard supplies at night. When someone left, the remaining family had to pick up all the work. Children too young to help were suddenly put to work driving oxen or gathering firewood. And if the deserter took the strongest animals or the best supplies, the wagon might be left stranded entirely. The emotional toll was just as bad. Diaries from the trail describe women sitting by campfires weeping after their husbands abandoned them, or siblings left behind feeling betrayed. For many, desertion wasn't just a logistical nightmare. It was a wound that never fully healed. And it wasn't always just partners. Sometimes whole groups split, leaving behind anyone they felt was slowing them down. A sick family could be abandoned by the train entirely, left with enough food for a few days and told to catch up if they could. Some never did. Deserters weren't guaranteed survival either. Traveling alone or in very small groups made them vulnerable to bandits, starvation, and attack. Some disappeared entirely, never seen again by the wagon train. Others joined different trains farther up the trail or took alternate routes to California or Utah, leaving behind the people who had counted on them. The Oregon Trail was supposed to be about building a new life, but sometimes it tore old lives apart. Desertion was one of the most heartbreaking ways the trail changed people, forcing them to make brutal choices, to stay and risk dying together, or leave and hope to live on their own. For those who stayed behind, the sight of someone walking away down the dusty trail was a memory that haunted them long after the journey was over.
Trading scams. Running out of supplies was bad, but getting cheated when you finally found some could be worse. Forts and trading posts were the lifelines of the Oregon Trail. After weeks of eating hardtack and bacon, pioneers looked forward to refilling their barrels, buying fresh tools, and maybe even finding medicine. But on the frontier, desperation made travelers vulnerable, and not every trader was honest. Some trading posts charged outrageous prices for basic goods. A pound of bacon that cost pennies back east could sell for 5 or 10 times the price on the trail. Flour might be old or full of weevils. Coffee could be moldy. And by the time a family discovered what they'd bought, they were already miles down the road with no way to get their money or supplies back. Then there were the so-called miracle cures. Traders sold tonics and elixirs that promised to prevent cholera, cure dysentery, or restore strength. Most of these were little more than alcohol mixed with herbs or sometimes dangerous ingredients like mercury or opium. People drank them anyway because they were terrified of getting sick, and sometimes the medicine made things worse. Some travelers bartered to avoid high prices, trading spare clothes, tools, or even heirlooms for food and powder. But bartering rarely favored the buyer. Traders knew how desperate pioneers were and offered as little as possible in return. Diaries from the trail are full of bitter complaints about being swindled out of valuables. Scams didn't just waste money, they could threaten survival. Buying spoiled bacon could make a whole family sick. Paying for weak powder could leave a wagon train unable to hunt or defend itself. And if a family spent too much at one fort, they might not have enough left for the next stop, forcing them to ration food dangerously thin. Some forts earned reputations for ripping travelers off, and wagon trains would warn each other about which posts to avoid if they could. But many times there was no choice. You bought what was offered, or you risked starving. The frustration was immense. After surviving river crossings, storms, and disease, pioneers sometimes felt betrayed. The people who were supposed to help them survive were bleeding them dry instead. It added an extra layer of stress to a journey that was already unforgiving.
Trading scams were a reminder that danger on the Oregon Trail didn't just come from nature. Sometimes it came from a smiling trader behind the counter, happy to sell you a barrel of bad flour at triple the price, knowing you had no choice but to take it.
Language barriers in mixed trains. On some wagon trains, you couldn't even warn your neighbor about danger because they didn't speak the same language. The Oregon Trail wasn't just traveled by English-speaking Americans. Families came from all over. German farmers, Irish laborers, Swedish immigrants, Dutch settlers, even French speakers heading west. When wagon trains formed, they often included a mix of these groups, and not everyone could communicate easily. Language barriers might not sound deadly at first, but on the trail, communication could mean survival. Wagon trains had to coordinate when to start moving, when to stop, where to cross rivers, and how to respond to emergencies. If one family didn't understand an order, they could hold up the entire group, or worse, wander off the trail entirely. Some mistakes were costly. Misunderstanding which river ford to use could mean driving a wagon into deeper water, losing supplies or animals. Mishearing the route could put a family miles off course, leaving them to catch up alone and exposing them to predators or bandits. Even more dangerous were emergencies like stampedes, sudden storms, or attacks. A shouted warning in English might not mean anything to a German or Swedish family. By the time they figured out what was happening, it could be too late to get their children into the wagon or keep their oxen under control. Decision-making became another source of conflict. Wagon trains often held meetings to vote on when to rest, what route to take, or whether to risk a river crossing. But if half the group didn't fully understand what was being discussed, resentment grew. Some trains split over these misunderstandings, with immigrant families forming their own smaller groups, which made everyone more vulnerable. Diaries from the trail sometimes mention the frustration of trying to coordinate with people who didn't speak the same language. Travelers wrote about shouting and gesturing just to explain where to camp or when to pack up. Others described arguments that escalated simply because the two sides couldn't make themselves understood. Some wagon trains learned to solve this problem by electing bilingual leaders or hiring translators, especially in areas with many immigrant families. This helped reduce mistakes, but it wasn't always possible, and not every wagon train had someone who could speak both languages fluently. Language barriers weren't just inconvenient, they could mean the difference between a smooth journey and disaster. Every hour lost to confusion burned through food supplies and risked arriving too late in the season. Every missed warning could cost a wagon, an animal, or a life. On the Oregon Trail, survival depended on clear communication.
and when words failed, so did safety.
Scapegoating sick travelers. Getting sick on the Oregon Trail didn't just risk your life, it could cost you your place in the wagon train. Disease was the #1 killer on the trail. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and measles spread like wildfire in wagon trains where dozens of families traveled, ate, and camped close together. Everyone knew how quickly an outbreak could wipe out a group. That fear drove people to take drastic measures, sometimes at the expense of the sick themselves. Travelers who started showing symptoms of illness could quickly become outcasts. A fever or a bad cough might be enough to make other families demand that they be left behind for the safety of the group. Sometimes a small party would stay with them, but just as often the wagon train moved on, leaving the sick to recover or die on their own. These decisions were not taken lightly, but they were made brutally fast. A wagon train couldn't afford to linger in one spot for long. Every day lost risked running into early snow in the mountains or running out of food before the next fort. For many, abandoning the sick was seen as the practical choice. But it came at a heavy emotional cost. Diaries from the trail describe families sobbing as they were forced to leave a loved one under a tree or beside the road with only a few supplies and a prayer that they might catch up later. Some never saw them again. Scapegoating sometimes went beyond simple health precautions. Unpopular members of a wagon train, immigrants, loners, or those accused of being lazy were sometimes the first to be blamed for bringing sickness into camp, even when others were already showing symptoms. Being labeled a danger to the group could be a death sentence. This fear also made travelers hide their symptoms for as long as possible. Someone with early cholera might keep walking, refusing to admit they were sick until they collapsed. By then, they may have already infected others. Even burial was done quickly and quietly. Graves were shallow and unmarked, partly out of fear that lingering near a dead body might spread disease, partly because there simply wasn't time to dig proper graves when the wagon train had to keep moving. In hindsight, not all of these choices were justified. Some people might have survived if the train had stopped to let them rest or offered better care. But on the trail, survival of the many often outweighed the survival of the few, at least in the minds of the healthy. On the Oregon Trail, sickness wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a threat to the entire community, and for some unlucky travelers, it was also a death sentence handed down by their neighbors. Religious conflicts weren't just a clash with the wilderness. Sometimes it was a clash of beliefs. The wagon trains heading west weren't all cut from the same cloth. Many were made up of neighbors or extended families, but others were a mix of strangers thrown together for safety. Among these groups were Mormon pioneers heading toward Utah, Catholic immigrants from Europe, and Protestant families looking for land in Oregon. Traveling side by side for months meant their differences were impossible to ignore. Religious tensions sometimes flared over the smallest things. Mormon wagon trains often kept strict rules about travel. No moving on the Sabbath, morning and evening prayers, and very organized daily routines. This could frustrate non-Mormon settlers who wanted to keep moving, regardless of the day, or who resented being told what to do. Then there were conflicts over resources. Large Mormon trains were famously organized and traveled with hundreds of wagons, which meant they reached watering holes and grazing lands in big numbers. Smaller groups sometimes arrived later, only to find the grass already eaten down and the water nearly gone. That led to accusations of unfairness, even though the larger trains had simply gotten there first. Morality became another point of conflict. Some settlers liked to drink, gamble, or swear around the campfire, which clashed with the stricter code of Mormon or deeply religious Protestant groups. Arguments broke out over whether wagon trains should travel on Sundays, whether camp activities should stop for prayer, or whether certain behavior should be banned altogether. Most of these disputes ended in grumbling or groups deciding to travel separately, but some escalated. Diaries mention shouting matches, fistfights, and even armed standoffs between groups that refused to compromise. The trail was stressful enough without adding moral and religious disagreements, but for many pioneers, faith was as central to survival as food and water. Splits like these could weaken a wagon train, leaving smaller groups more vulnerable to attack or accidents. But some people preferred the risk of going alone to enduring weeks of arguments and judgment. Others stayed together, but simmered with resentment for the rest of the journey. Religious conflict on the trail was a reminder that the Oregon Trail wasn't just about fighting nature. It was about learning to live with other people who didn't always share your way of life. The open prairie may have been endless, but inside a wagon train there was nowhere to escape from a feud. For some settlers, the greatest challenge wasn't crossing a river or climbing a mountain. It was surviving months of travel alongside people who saw the world in a completely different way. Trail madness. The Oregon Trail didn't just wear down bodies, it broke minds. Traveling west was brutally hard on the body, but it was just as punishing on the mind. Day after day, pioneers walked through endless stretches of grassland, seeing the same horizon for weeks at a time. There were no towns, no familiar faces, and few breaks from the monotony. Add hunger, exhaustion, and the constant fear of death, and the human mind started to crack. Travelers wrote about companions who simply lost their senses. Some became paranoid, convinced the wagon train was cursed, or that others were plotting against them. Others developed hallucinations, seeing phantom lights, hearing voices in the wind, or claiming to see family members long dead walking alongside the trail. This trail madness could turn dangerous. Some victims abandoned their wagons and wandered off into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Others became violent, lashing out at neighbors or even their own families. With no doctors and no safe place to rest, fellow travelers had to make terrible decisions: tie the person down, try to keep them calm, or leave them behind if they became a danger to the group.
The stress that caused this madness wasn't just the landscape. Death was everywhere on the trail. Fresh graves lined the route, and wagon trains sometimes passed multiple burials a day. Families grieving lost children or spouses had to keep walking, burying their pain along with their dead. For some, that grief eventually turned into breakdowns that left them unable to function. Even children weren't immune. Diaries mention children becoming listless, refusing to eat, or suddenly running off screaming into the prairie. Parents had to watch their kids closely, not just to keep them safe from accidents, but to make sure the strain of the trail wasn't driving them into dangerous behavior. The eerie emptiness of the prairie made everything worse. With no trees, no landmarks, and no escape from the wind, even the sound of the wheels could start to feel oppressive. It was easy to feel like the world was closing in, or that you were the only people left alive. Prairie madness wasn't officially diagnosed at the time, but it was whispered about. Travelers feared it, knowing that once someone's mind started to go, there was little that could be done. The Oregon Trail is often remembered as a test of physical endurance, but it was just as much a test of mental strength. Those endless miles didn't just kill the weak, they drove some to madness, proving that survival wasn't only about reaching Oregon with your body intact, but with your mind still your own.
Despair-induced suicide. For some pioneers, the trail didn't end in Oregon. It ended when the weight of the journey became too much to bear. The Oregon Trail wasn't just physically brutal, it was emotionally crushing. Families buried children and spouses along the roadside, sometimes days apart. Wagons broke, animals died, food ran out, and storms washed away what little security they had left. After months of this, some travelers just lost hope, and when that happened, the trail claimed them in a different way. Suicide was not often spoken about openly, but it happened. Some pioneers used their own rifles, ending their lives quickly in camp or slipping away to do it in private. Others walked into rivers and never came back, drowning themselves rather than continuing the endless march west. There were even accounts of travelers deliberately walking away from the wagon train into the open prairie, disappearing without a trace. The decision often came after a series of devastating losses. Imagine losing 2 of your children to cholera, watching your oxen die, and realizing your wagon can no longer carry what you need to survive. Some felt that continuing was pointless, that even if they reached Oregon, there would be nothing left for them there. The impact on those left behind was profound. Families had to bury their loved ones as quickly as possible and then keep moving because the wagon train could not wait. There was little time for grief. Many survivors wrote in their diaries about their shock, sorrow, and guilt, wondering if they could have done something to stop it. Religious stigma made things even harder. Suicide was considered a grave sin, and some families tried to keep it a secret. Graves might be unmarked or placed away from the trail so that future travelers wouldn't gossip about what had happened. These tragedies also frightened other travelers. Despair could be contagious. If one person gave up hope, others worried who might be next. Leaders often worked hard to keep morale up,
encouraging the train to sing songs, hold prayers, and celebrate small victories just to keep people focused on moving forward. Despair-induced suicide is one of the most haunting parts of Oregon Trail history because it shows just how heavy the emotional burden was. The trail wasn't just a test of strength and endurance. It was a test of willpower. For most, reaching Oregon meant keeping hope alive through every hardship. For others, hope ran out long before the road did. On the Oregon Trail, death came from disease, accidents, and starvation. But sometimes it came from within.
Homesickness, depression. For some pioneers, the hardest part of the Oregon Trail wasn't the rivers or the mountains. It was missing home so much they stopped wanting to live. Leaving for the Oregon Trail meant leaving everything familiar behind. Family members who stayed behind, church communities, friends, even the house you grow up in. At first, the excitement of the journey masked the pain. But after weeks or months of walking, staring at the same empty prairie day after day, homesickness could hit like an illness, and in some cases, it truly became one. Travelers called it melancholy, but we'd recognize it today as depression. It started with sadness, but sometimes grew so severe that the person refused to eat, work, or even speak. This was especially common among children and young mothers who missed their parents, siblings, or friends back home. Food was scarce enough already, and refusing to eat was dangerous. Some pioneers literally wasted away, growing too weak to walk. Their refusal to take nourishment made every day's march harder for their families, who had to slow down, carry them in the wagon, and devote precious energy to coaxing them back to life. Diaries from the trail mention cases where travelers seemed perfectly healthy, but simply died of sorrow. In some heartbreaking entries, parents recorded burying children who had given up hope entirely, wasting away after weeks of refusing food or water. Leaders of wagon trains often tried to keep spirits high, knowing that morale was just as important as rations. Some encouraged singing in the evenings, prayer meetings, or storytelling around the campfire to fight the crushing loneliness. But for some, the memories of home were too heavy to shake. Homesickness could also spread. When one person began to despair, it could bring down the spirits of an entire wagon. Families might argue more. Tension would rise, and progress slowed as emotional exhaustion set in. This form of death on the trail is one of the hardest to imagine because it wasn't caused by disease or weather or bandits. It was caused by longing, the thought of never seeing home again, of never sitting by the same hearth or walking the same familiar road, simply became too much. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a physical challenge, it was an emotional gauntlet. To survive, you had to keep walking not just with your feet, but with your will. If that will broke, no amount of food or medicine could save you. For many pioneers, Oregon wasn't just a destination, it was the only thing keeping them going. For those who couldn't hold on to that hope, the trail became their final resting place. Watching children die was the trail's cruelest test.
not crossing rivers or climbing mountains, but burying your own children and still having to keep walking. Children were among the most vulnerable travelers on the trail. They were smaller, weaker, and far more likely to succumb to the diseases that swept through wagon trains: cholera, dysentery, measles, whooping cough. They were also more prone to accidents, falling under wagon wheels, drowning in rivers, or being kicked by animals. For parents, the trail was a constant exercise in fear. When sickness struck, there was often little that could be done. Medicine was scarce and usually ineffective. Parents watched helplessly as fevers rose, diarrhea drained their children's strength, and coughs racked their small bodies. Sometimes the illness passed, sometimes it didn't. When a child died, the grief was overwhelming, but the wagon train couldn't stop for long. Parents had to dig a grave by the roadside, often with nothing more than a shovel or bare hands, lay their child to rest, say a few words if they had the strength, and then hitch the oxen and keep moving. The trail waited for no one. Diaries from the trail described this heartbreak in painful detail. Mothers wrote of sewing shrouds out of their own clothes, fathers carving tiny markers from wagon boards, and families sitting silently in the wagon for miles after the burial. Some couldn't bring themselves to speak for days. The psychological toll was enormous. Some parents withdrew completely, going through the motions of survival but barely speaking to anyone. Others fell into deep depression, refusing to eat or work, endangering the entire family. A few even suffered full mental breakdowns, screaming, wandering off, or refusing to go on. And the cruelty didn't always stop there. Graves were often shallow because the train couldn't spare hours for digging. Wolves or coyotes sometimes dug them up, and passing travelers would later find the remains disturbed. Parents knew this was a risk, but had no choice. They had to keep moving or risk losing more lives to hunger, storms, or disease. Some families lost more than one child over the course of the journey. What was meant to be a hopeful trip to a new life turned into a slow, drawn-out nightmare. One grave after another, stretching across hundreds of miles. The Oregon Trail is often remembered as a story of bravery and adventure, but for many parents, it was a story of unimaginable grief. They carried on not because they were ready, but because they had to, walking away from freshly dug graves with tears still on their faces. Surviving the trail wasn't just about keeping your body alive. It was about finding the strength to keep going after your heart had been broken.
Losing entire wagons on a day. One bad day on the trail could erase months of planning, leaving a family with nothing but what they could carry. For pioneers, the wagon wasn't just transportation. It was the pantry, the tool shed, the closet, and the home all in one. Every pound of flour, every blanket, every rifle and heirloom was packed inside. Losing it meant losing everything, and it could happen in an instant. Sometimes it was a river crossing gone wrong, a wheel caught in the mud, the current tipped the wagon, and in seconds it was floating downstream. Other times it was fire, a single spark from a campfire catching the canvas cover, turning the wagon into a torch before anyone could react. Stampedes, broken axles, even lightning strikes could destroy a wagon and scatter its contents across the prairie. The mental shock was often worse than the physical loss. Travelers described sitting by the wreckage in stunned silence, watching their possessions sink in a river or burn to ash. After months of careful planning, rationing, and packing, everything was gone in minutes. Then came the hard decisions. A wagon train couldn't stop forever. Leaders would call emergency meetings to decide what to do with the now wagonless family. If there were spare wagons or parts, they might help rebuild. If not, families had to beg for space in other wagons, often giving up most of what little survived. When no help was available, the choices were grim. Some families turned back east, their dream of Oregon ending right there. Others walked the rest of the way on their backs. Children sometimes pushed wheelbarrows or dragged sleds loaded with food or bedding, mile after mile. These losses could tear a wagon train apart. Arguments broke out over who should give up space or supplies to help. Some groups shared generously, taking in the displaced family and dividing their goods. Others refused, fearing it would leave them too short to survive the journey. The psychological toll lingered. Travelers who lost wagons often wrote of feeling cursed or hopeless, dreading every bump and crossing afterward. Some became overly cautious, slowing the whole train. Others grew bitter, blaming the wagon master or even their fellow travelers for not helping enough. Losing a wagon wasn't just about losing possessions. It meant losing security. The thin wall of wood and canvas that protected a family from the wind, rain, and sun was gone. Every night from then on meant sleeping fully exposed to the elements, a reminder of what had been lost. The Oregon Trail didn't just demand strength, it demanded resilience, the ability to lose everything in a single day and still find the will to get up the next morning and keep walking west.
Burial fatigue. At first, every grave brought tears, but after enough deaths, pioneers just picked up their shovels and kept going. Death was a constant companion on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, dysentery, accidents, and starvation claimed thousands of lives. Early in the journey, every death was a tragedy that stopped the entire wagon train. Families would gather for prayer, sing hymns, and mark the graves carefully, sometimes carving names into wood or stone so they could be remembered. But as the months wore on and the graves multiplied, grief turned into something else. There was simply no time to mourn every death. The wagon train had to keep moving or risk running out of food, being caught by storms, or falling behind the season. Funerals became shorter. Graves became shallower. Sometimes there were no markers at all, just hastily disguised mounds of dirt to keep wolves from digging them up. Travelers wrote in their diaries about becoming strangely numb. One woman wrote that she had cried until there were no tears left. Another man described burying 3 companions in one day, saying that after the 3rd grave he felt nothing but weariness. Children grew up on the trail with death as part of daily life. They saw bodies sewn into blankets, watched graves being dug, and learned quickly not to ask too many questions. For them, death was no longer shocking. It was expected. This numbness, sometimes called burial fatigue, was a kind of survival mechanism. If pioneers allowed themselves to grieve fully every time, they might not have been able to keep going. Instead, they learned to put their emotions aside and focus on the next mile, the next river, the next camp. But the psychological cost was enormous. Many travelers later admitted that the endless burials haunted them for the rest of their lives. Some felt guilty for not mourning enough, wondering if they had been hardened beyond repair. Others avoided talking about the trail entirely, unable to revisit the memories of how many they had buried along the way. The Oregon Trail left a literal path of graves across the West, thousands of them, many unmarked and lost to time. For the people who dug them, the journey became less about who had died and more about who was still alive and able to walk. Burial fatigue is one of the most haunting realities of the trail, because it shows how survival forced pioneers to change. They didn't just lose friends and family, they lost pieces of themselves, piece by piece, grave by grave. On the Oregon Trail, death became so common that grief had to wait until Oregon, if the survivors ever made it there at all.
Eternal monotony. The prairie wasn't always exciting. Sometimes it was so empty and endless, it drove people mad. The Oregon Trail is remembered for its dangers, floods, blizzards, stampedes, but one of its most insidious threats was simply the monotony. After leaving the wooded areas near the Missouri River, pioneers faced hundreds of miles of grassland, flat horizon, endless sky, the same landscape day after day. There were no mountains yet, no trees for shade, and often no sign of civilization for weeks. At first it was breathtaking, an ocean of grass stretching as far as the eye could see. But as the days dragged on, the beauty gave way to boredom, and then to something darker. Walking beside a wagon for 12 to 15 miles a day, staring at the same unchanging horizon, wore down the mind. Travelers wrote in their diaries about the crushing sameness. Nothing but grass and sky for as far as the eye can see. Some became restless and irritable, snapping at their companions over small things. Others grew depressed and withdrawn, walking in silence for hours, barely speaking at camp. The monotony could even lead to hallucinations. Some pioneers reported seeing shapes or figures on the horizon that weren't there, mistaking heat shimmers for water, or imagining distant wagons when there were none. Children sometimes became convinced they were walking in circles because every day looked exactly like the one before. Boredom was more than just an inconvenience. It could be dangerous. Distracted travelers might not notice hazards on the trail, like deep ruts or approaching storms. Some pushed themselves too hard, trying to break the routine by traveling extra miles, which exhausted animals and led to injuries. Parents struggled to keep children entertained and cooperative during these stretches.
Games, songs, and storytelling became a crucial part of camp life, not just for fun, but for mental survival. Some groups organized campfire dances, played fiddles, or told jokes to break up the crushing routine. But not everyone coped well. There are accounts of pioneers who abandoned their wagons entirely, convinced they couldn't walk one more mile through nothingness. Others became reckless, insisting on taking dangerous shortcuts just to break the monotony, often with disastrous results. The endless prairie was a test of patience and mental endurance. There were no grand events to mark the passing of time, just one horizon after another. For some, that was harder to endure than storms or attacks. At least those were exciting. Something happened. Eternal monotony might not have left graves behind like cholera did, but it still claimed its victims in poor decisions, broken spirits, and minds that simply couldn't take one more day of grass, sky, and silence.
Hopelessness during storms. When the rain didn't stop, neither did the fear. Every drop felt like it was washing away their chance to survive. Prairie storms weren't short summer showers. When the skies opened up on the Oregon Trail, the rain could last for days, sometimes more than a week. The first day might be tolerable. Travelers huddled under wagon covers, telling themselves it would pass soon. But by the second or third day, the trail became a river of mud. By the fourth, hope began to slip away. Wagons sank axle deep in the muck. Oxen and mules stood shivering, unable to find dry ground or enough grass to eat. Wet harnesses rubbed sores into their hides, and constant dampness weakened them fast. Every day of rain meant more animals growing sick and more risk that they drop dead in the yoke. Losing a team could mean losing the wagon and everything in it. Clothes and bedding never dried, leaving travelers cold and miserable. Fires were nearly impossible to light, and when they did catch, the smoke blew into people's faces, stinging eyes already red from exhaustion. Meals were reduced to whatever could be eaten cold. The psychological grind was the worst part. The sound of constant rain on canvas became maddening, a dull, endless drumming that made it hard to sleep and harder to keep spirits up. Travelers wrote in their diaries about walking in silence for hours, heads down, soaked to the bone, mud sucking at their boots. Being stuck in one place was dangerous too. Stagnant camps bred sickness, with dysentery and fever spreading quickly among people who couldn't stay warm or dry. But moving forward meant slogging through deep mud, exhausting animals that were already starving. And then there were the rivers. After days of rain, creeks became raging torrents. Crossings that were safe before the storm became deadly, with currents strong enough to sweep away wagons. Families sometimes had to wait for water levels to drop, which meant more time stuck in the wet, watching supplies dwindle and animals weaken. The hopelessness could be overwhelming. Travelers saw their careful plans unravel with each passing day. Every delay meant getting closer to winter in the mountains. Every dead animal meant more weight that had to be thrown out.
every meal of cold beans and wet bread reminded them that their survival was hanging by a thread. When the sun finally broke through, it was a relief beyond words, but the damage was already done. The mud still slowed progress, the animals were still weak, and morale had been ground down like the ruts in the trail. Storms on the Oregon Trail didn't just flood the prairie. They drowned hope, one drop at a time.
Moral collapse. The Oregon Trail didn't just test bodies, it tested morality. And sometimes people failed. The journey west was supposed to be about hope. New land, new lives, new beginnings. But months of hunger, sickness, exhaustion, and grief stripped people down to their rawest instincts. When survival was on the line, rules about right and wrong started to blur. Theft was one of the first cracks in the moral foundation. Early on, neighbors shared freely. A little flour for a little bacon, a spare tool for a promise to return it. But as supplies ran low, that generosity dried up. People began sneaking food from each other's barrels, untying livestock at night, or taking firewood from another wagon's pile. In a world with no police, justice was harsh and immediate. Wagon trains held their own trials and handed out punishments on the spot, sometimes banishing thieves, other times tying them to wagons or even hanging them if the theft threatened the group's survival. Infighting became another symptom of moral collapse. Stress boiled over into shouting matches, sometimes escalating into fistfights or gunfire. Leaders were overthrown, and groups fractured just when unity was most needed. And then there were the darkest moments, when hunger became unbearable. Travelers ate the leather off their wagon covers, boiled shoes for broth, and in the most extreme cases resorted to cannibalism. The Donner Party is the most infamous example. Trapped in the Sierra Nevada by early snow and forced to eat the bodies of those who had died. But whispers of similar incidents followed other wagon trains too. Incidents never officially recorded, but passed down in hushed tones. These acts weren't done out of cruelty, but desperation. People who would never dream of stealing or fighting back home found themselves doing whatever it took to keep their families alive. Some couldn't live with what they had done, carrying the guilt with them for the rest of their lives. Others justified it as necessary, the only way to survive. Moral collapse wasn't just about individual choices. It reshaped entire wagon trains. Groups that had started as cooperative communities sometimes arrived in Oregon bitter, divided, and forever changed by the decisions they'd made on the trail. The Oregon Trail is often remembered as a triumph, the story of pioneers brave enough to cross a continent. But there was a cost to that bravery, and part of it was paid in humanity. The trail didn't just demand endurance. It demanded choices that haunted survivors long after the wagons stopped rolling. When pushed to the edge of survival, even the most ordinary people discovered what they were capable of. And sometimes what they were capable of frightened them more than the trail itself.